I was in pain. I mean, I was in pain for so long that I didn't care if I was in a band. I didn't care if I was alive. I was taking drugs and people wanted me to talk about it, but I tried for months and months not to talk about it, you know. I never made a spectacle out of it. I never promoted it. And now I'm going to be associated with heroin for the rest of my life. I tried to keep it away from everybody because no matter how hard I don't want to be a role model or influence anyone, I still do.
The last couple of months when I was doing $400 worth every day, I was definitely noticing things about my memory, and I knew that eventually my health would start getting a lot worse.
One of the reasons millions of people identify with Kurt Cobain emotionally is because he was very open about his depression, his addictions, his mood swings. But also, Kurt was very open, especially during his later years, about how happy he was becoming. Kurt was a very contradictory figure, a very complex person.
I'm constantly confused. I'm just as confused as anybody, if not more. You know, everyone deals with themselves in different ways, you know, and everyone feels insecure at times and depressed. And, you know, sure, it happens to me all the time, just like anybody. I can't think of exact reasons because, I mean, that's why people feel really vulnerable and confused, because they can't understand why they're feeling that way. So it takes me a while to figure it out. But, you know, I have enough friends and pretty good relationship with my family to where I don't ever feel completely lost, you know, like everyone hates me. Yeah.
You never feel completely lost, Wanda?
Well, not to where I'm gonna, like, commit suicide or, like, run away or anything. I feel I have enough support from friends and family. When I'm not stable, I'm not way down low and feeling like death.
That was from an interview conducted on November 21st, 1991. It was done in Paris, France by journalists Anne-Catherine and Vivian Vogue. At the time, Nirvana was in the midst of touring Europe as part of the release for Nevermind. Nevermind had just come out 2 months earlier on September 24th of 91.
I love to be alone sometimes. There are plenty of times during the day or even like a whole week I just love to be by myself, and I can usually do it too. A few years ago, I was a lot more frustrated, obviously. I mean, it comes out in the songs a lot more and in the lyrics because there wasn't much appreciation for what we were doing at the time. You know, it's not like we were ever really searching for success. It's just appreciation from just some people saying that we like what you're doing and you affect us in a way. So within the last couple of years, I've been able to throw in a lot more happier and different types of emotion other than just anger and aggression all the time. I really wanted to make a happier record this time. I wanted to just have a different mood, and I'd like to do that with every album. Maybe the next one will be ridiculously happy and cheesy, and stupid, but or maybe it'll be totally way more mean and pissed off than the first record. I don't know. We just like to change with every album in emotion. I think this one kind of balances in between the two pretty well.
Throughout this video, I'm going to share with you multiple clips of Kurt Cobain discussing his highs and lows. The clips you heard at the beginning of this video were both from 1993. The first is from the interview Kurt did with MTV in December of 93, and the second clip was from an unidentified interview from the same year. It's one of those interviews where it's not clear exactly who the original source is. In any case, I want to share with you now a few quotes from Kurt which kind of go against the popular image of who Kurt was. Despite his image of being someone who was always depressed, in his own words, he was actually getting happier and happier as the years went on.
I couldn't be happier right now. I don't know, since I haven't had a stomach problem and I've had a child and I'm married now, I'm sure I'm a lot easier to deal with, I'm not as grumpy as I used to be. I don't know, I just think our morale is at its best right now, I love my child, it's really fun, really fun. I had no idea. Yeah, it has. It's made me a lot more positive. I have a goal now. I have a child to raise, and so that gives me more reason to want to live. It's just everyone thinks of me as like this emotional wreck, this total negative black star.
People ask me that all the time. Like, even I went out to a club a couple of months ago, and this kid just nonchalantly said, just out of the blue, "Why do you always look like you're mad?" I'm not mad. I'm in a perfectly happy mood right now. What's wrong with you? Are you sad? You know, most people think that if I look at them and I don't smile, that I'm pissed off. So I go out of my way to make it look like I'm enjoying myself.
Every time that we play a show, I can look out in the audience and I can say, these kids really like our band, and I know they genuinely like us, you know, they like our music. That's just why I'm so happy about being in this band still. I wasn't happy a couple of years ago, I mean, obviously. But just being on tour every night, it's just been great. I'm so grateful that there are that many kids that still like us, that have overlooked all the rumors and all the stupid things that were printed about us in the last 2 years, you know.
One of the reasons Kurt started to feel happier is because the major stomach problems he had were finally getting better. Beginning around the mid to late 80s, Kurt started experiencing chronic stomach pains. As you'll hear from Kurt himself in a moment, for several years he was never able to get this condition properly diagnosed. And so this frequent severe stomach pain Kurt had exhausted him mentally for years on end. It made him more depressed, it made him more irritable, angry, and so on. Unfortunately, because he wasn't able to get the proper medication he needed, Kurt made the very ill-advised decision to use heroin in order to numb his chronic stomach pain. This wasn't the only reason Kurt was taking heroin, but it was a big contributing factor. Now, going back to the interview Kurt did in December of '93, he says he was finally able to get his stomach pain under control, and that it's been about a year since he experienced those intense pains.
I should take some drugs, you know. May as well become a junkie, because I felt like a junkie every day. You know, waking up starving, forcing myself to eat, you know, barfing it back up. Just imagine trying to eat your 3 meals a day and just concentrating and just crying at times, just like, I'm in pain all the time, you know. And being on tour was a lot worse too, you know, it made it even worse, so.
When did they the medicine that took you out?
About a year ago.
That's good.
Yeah. It's gone.
Yeah?
Yeah. I finally have been prescribed the right stomach medicine after 6 years of being in constant pain. Finally, I haven't had a stomach problem for like over a year now. They never figured out what it was. I mean, most gastrointestinal doctors don't know anything about the stomach diseases. They just have a PhD. They get paid a lot of money for pretending and prescribing you different drugs, and it's a total scam.
As mentioned earlier, Kurt was a complex person. Even though by 1993 he was much happier than before, he still had unresolved emotional issues. I showed you a clip a few minutes ago of Kurt discussing his daughter and how much he loves her. That was from the interview he did with Spanish journalist Joaquin Loqui in Seattle on August 11th of '93. The following is from the same interview where Kurt talks about how much he envies people who just seem to be happy all the time.
I kind of envy people at times who are blissfully happy, and a lot of those people aren't bothered with the complications of knowledge and everything else that life has to offer. You know, I know a lot of people who are simpletons, you know, they're very simple, that they can enjoy their lives and be totally happy and secure with, you know, just watching sports on television and having a beer every once in a while, you know. So, and I've always felt too complicated, so I kind of envy those people. And I'm not saying that I'm smarter than most people, it's just that I'm too sensitive, and I wish sometimes I could just enjoy the simple things in life, you know, and just not forget about everything else.
In another interview, Kurt states that he actually wants to stay angry because it's good for his songwriting. Granted, this interview was 4 years earlier in 1989, so Kurt was in a different headspace then, but nevertheless, it's still interesting to get some insight into Kurt's mindset about this.
So what do you write your songs about? It's hard to say. Anger, negativity. I imagine I am becoming happier. I find myself sometimes making things hard for myself so I can still have a little bit of anger. What's that?
Perhaps Kurt was being sarcastic, but even still, I think there's some truth to what he was saying here. That interview was conducted in New York City by journalist John Robb on July 14th of '89. Now, going back to the November '91 interview in Paris, Kurt is asked if he feels like he doesn't belong in society. This is what he had to say.
Well, I've always felt that way. I've never been able to understand why so many people would want to be so normal. How could everyone, like the majority of people, be happy with just television sets? Never understood it. I grew up in a really small, secluded logging town where I couldn't relate to anyone. I didn't have any real true friends. And so just within the last 5 or 6, about 8 years, I've started to have friends that I can relate to.
Later in that same interview, Kurt spoke about his frustration towards American Nirvana fans, and that he liked touring in Europe because he felt the European fans weren't annoying like the US ones. This is what he had to say.
We were going through a really weird period about 2 months ago on an American tour. I was getting really frustrated with it because all of a sudden I was totally consumed with people, asking me for autographs, and people would walk by and they would stop the little tracks and go, ah! It's been a really nice, almost a vacation coming over to Europe because people don't have that kind of a mentality for the most part. We're still asked for autographs a lot, but not as much. It's brought us down to earth again. We've been able to relax. But for a while, we were really frustrated, and so the only way for me to react towards this was to get really drunk every night and fucked up and just break my equipment and be really abusive to the audience in hopes of weeding some of the dorks out, in hopes they don't come back. I don't know if it had a good enough effect on anybody or not.
The following is another quote from Kurt Cobain regarding his frustration towards certain Nirvana fans. This is from one of the last interviews Kurt ever did on February 11th, 1994, less than 2 months before his death. This interview was conducted by journalist Chuck Crisafulli in Toulon, France. Quote, "When we first started to get successful, I was extremely judgmental of the people in the audience. I held each of them to a sort of punk rock ethos. It upset me that we were attracting and entertaining the very people that a lot of my music was a reaction against. I've since become much better at accepting people for who they are. Regardless of who they were before they came to the show, I get a few hours to try and subvert the way they view the world. It's not that I'm trying to dictate. It's just that I am afforded a certain platform on which I can express my views. At the very least, I always get the last word. I was much more jaded 5 years ago before all this craziness. I was pretty negative. At the time, I was completely infatuated with punk rock. I lived the marginalized ideal, the complete rejection of all commerce, full-out rebellion. Impossible to become famous with punk rock, impossible to go outside the limits of Seattle. I didn't want anything. I was very good the way I was. I started to feel more confident once Bleach came out. The album's relative success and the little concerts we were giving in American clubs helped me overcome my doubts and anxieties. It's thanks to the 10 people who applauded us in 1986 or 87 that I'm here today. I already felt like I shot the moon. I was being paid to play my songs, and what's more, people liked it. For a guy like me, it was already glorious. We were going to the little lost towns and the local radio stations played our single. Today, I feel a little overwhelmed. All these people who pay to see us, I don't understand it. There have been so many bands who abandoned their most loyal defenders when success took them by surprise. In a way, I was afraid of becoming an orphan. And then I understood that I didn't owe anyone anything, that I needed to follow my natural path without turning back. If certain fans feel dropped, if they can't share a band that they love with others, they can go away. I have no sympathy for frustrated egoists. But as far as the larger public goes, all the people who bought Nevermind a few months after its release, I can't say anything about them. I don't know who they are, who they voted for, what they look like. Some of them might beat their wives, others might abandon their dogs when they move. Do I have anything in common with these people? So many totally miss the message of Smells Like Teen Spirit. The people who made the song a phenomenon by the music that's on MTV, university and high school kids. They didn't understand that the message was aimed at them, that the song was an attack against the youthful spirit of the universities and parties. I have to admit the obvious. The public at large hasn't understood much about the band." End quote. Now, interestingly, Kurt's opinion about most of his US fans did seem to change. On November 29, 1993, Kurt said the following to journalist Stefan Shirazi, quote, To be able to sell out an arena and know that 98% of those kids are honestly good kids, nice people who are sincere, it's a great feeling to know that. After shows, I'm happy to go to the tour bus and talk to the kids there. They're really nice." End quote. Kurt was quite conflicted about fame. The idea that he didn't want to be famous at all is not accurate, as I'll show you in a moment. However, Kurt didn't want to become a polished mainstream star. He didn't want to be perceived as someone abandoning his underground roots. The following is a clip from the interview I did with Bruce Pavitt. Bruce is the co-founder of Nirvana's original record label, Sub Pop. I asked him about Kurt Cobain's perspective on fame. So when it comes to Kurt, one of the things that people debate about sometimes is, did Kurt want to become famous or did he not want to become famous? In your honest opinion, what do you think?
He totally wanted to be famous, but he also was very conflicted because he very much identified with punk ideals. And so that's what made the whole story so fascinating, is that conflict. And Sub Pop was kind of the same way. You had the sub, which was very underground, and pop, which is the implication that underground music could be popular. My biz partner, John Poneman, has gone on record as saying, he had some talks with Kurt. And I didn't know this at the time, but he recently said, yeah, I had talks with Kurt, and he was like, we should be selling millions of records, And he was very confident in Nirvana's potential to sell. And it's, the main reason he left Sub Pop, that even though he sold 40,000 copies, which in the indie world was at that time successful, he was like, no, that's not good enough. We should be selling millions of records. And I was like, I wasn't thinking in those terms. I was not thinking that we're going to sign bands that will sell millions of records. That was not in my frame of mind at all. I did not think that was possible coming from where I did, where, things change quickly. That's for sure.
Nirvana is a 3-piece underground alternative grunge rock band from Seattle, Washington, or the outskirts of Seattle, Washington. And that's about it. That's what we are. We play a very powerful, high energy type of rock and roll. We move around on stage a lot and scream.
That was from January 6, 1990, from an interview Nirvana did in Seattle at the University of Washington. The following is from one of Kurt Cobain's friends, Kurt Danielson, another musician from the Seattle grunge scene. Here, he talks about Kurt Cobain's complex and conflicted personality. This is from Gillian Gigar's book, Entertain Us, The Rise of Nirvana. Quote, Kurt was conflicted. His natural aesthetic was to write pop songs, but the ethos at the time was very aggressive and heavy. You might be convinced that Kurt had a total hard rock aesthetic after seeing a performance or having a conversation with him. And then you turn around and read something in the press or see him at a party and he'd say something completely the opposite. So you never knew where he stood about certain things. And I would step back and watch him, fascinated to see what he'd say or do next. I felt like I knew him fairly well, yet in the end, I would say that's not really true. I knew certain facets of him, those he chose to present or those he was able to present at a given moment. It's like anybody else. You never really truly know a person completely. Even if you're closely allied with them or close friends or married or whatever, it's a mystery. Human beings are a mystery, and Kurt was certainly an example of that. We'd just stay awake and talk in the dark like I used to with my brother. You could have a nice conversation with Kurt if the two of you were alone. He was on the one hand darkly comic, a very funny person with an ingenious sense of humor. Very cutting, very acerbic black humor, the blackest. But on the other hand, he was a gentle, empathetic, sympathetic, kind person. One thing Kurt was really good at was absorbing whatever was in his environment and then kind of regurgitating it in his own image. This is what artists do in general, and I noticed that ideas I would mention to him would show up in his lyrics. For example, Lithium. We were talking about antidepressants and mental illness, depression in particular, and the various pharmaceutical agents available to treat such a problem. And I was talking about lithium, a salt that is naturally found in certain lakes like in North Germany, I believe. Anyways, he was fascinated by that, and besides, the word itself is beautiful. Lithium sounds good and it's a great title. And there was another anecdote I told him about a woman I heard of who had an aneurysm. It was a horrible episode in her life. I told Kurt this story and then comes Aneurysm, the Nirvana song. He was very self-aware. He may have presented a front that denied that, but in fact it was a front. He pretended like he never practiced, but in fact he practiced incessantly. And he demanded a lot from the band, and he was a relentless taskmaker. After a show or an interview, Kurt would sit there and parcel out comments to Chris and Chad, saying things like, "Oh, that was really good. You did a good job, Chad." Or, "Chris, I liked what you played there." And then Chris may say, "Well, despite a screw-up in the performance, I think it worked." And Kurt would say, "Really?" And then they'd make that quote-unquote screw-up part of the song, whatever that was. And sometimes he'd sing a song over and over again at various shows, and later he'd admit he was just singing something he'd made up off the top of his head. And he'd write the real lyrics at the last minute and then record them. End quote. Now, in terms of Lithium, one of the most famous examples of Kurt Cobain getting really moody and really angry took place during the recording of that song. When Nirvana was trying to record Lithium, things weren't going well in the studio, so Kurt basically snapped and just lost it. The craziness that followed basically became the recording of Endless Nameless, the hidden track on Nevermind. The following is from the joint interview Nevermind producer Butch Vig did along with Dave Grohl and Chris Novoselic in 2011. This was for the 20th anniversary of Nevermind, and at this point in the interview, Butch discusses Kurt's meltdown.
There was really only one time there was mass destruction in the studio. I know exactly how it happened. These guys will remember too. We had a few attempts at recording Lithium. For whatever reason, the band kept speeding up.
What do you mean, whatever reason?
For whatever reason.
Why does a band speed up?
That's when the black cloud came over the studio. Like,
there was a momentary black cloud that came over Sound City.
My fault. My bad.
We were halfway into the record. I think it was like maybe the fifth or sixth song that we recorded when we attempted Lithium. And after about 3 or 4 takes, something snapped in Kurt. And he launched into this song, and I didn't know what it was, and they just launched in this crazy, insane jam. And it was kind of scary. I had never seen that kind of sort of frustration and rage in Kurt. I mean, the veins in his neck and just what was going on inside him. And that's, of course, the song that ended up being the bonus track on Nevermind. It was kind of scary to see, I have to admit. At the end of it, he smashed up his guitar, and the whole thing, luckily, because we were trying to record Lithium, was all captured on tape. And I remember sort of this pause, like, okay, I guess that's it for today, you guys. That sounded pretty cool. Okay, I didn't really know what to say. And I went out, and Kurt just walked off, and you guys were like, okay, well, I guess, yeah, we'll just go home. And then I was like, okay, well, I got to find another left-handed guitar.
The following is a clip of Kurt discussing his emotional temperament.
I'm such a nihilistic jerk half the time. I'm so fucking sarcastic at times, and then at other times I'm so vulnerable and so sincere. And that's pretty much how most people my age are. I'm pissed off about everything in general. And so all these songs are pretty much about my battle with things that piss me off. And that's just the whole theme of the whole album.
It's not clear when or where that interview was conducted, but I believe the album he was referring to is In Utero. Now, going back to the interview from November 29th of 93, Kurt was asked if he feels less pessimistic nowadays, and he replied, "Absolutely. But I'll never lose all my pessimism." This matches up perfectly with other things Kurt said in interviews during the final months of his life, that although he wasn't 100% happy, he was definitely much happier than he was before. As mentioned earlier, a big part of the reason Kurt was much happier at this point in his life is the fact that he was now a father. He loved having a child. The following is another quote from that November 29th interview where Kurt talks about his daughter, Frances Bean. Quote, "I've always been chronically depressed or at least pessimistic for a part of each day. But now I only have to see Frances for 10 minutes and my spirits are lifted so high I feel like a completely different person." End quote. In this next clip, we're going to go back to the interview from December of 93. Kurt explains that in his view, a lot of the negativity associated with Nirvana was deliberately perpetuated by the press. Quote, "I've talked to journalists about all kinds of positive things, all kinds of things that I enjoy and love about being in rock and roll. But it's never printed. Even at the height of our explosion with Nevermind, we were all trying to get those things across. But we're at the mercy of the journalist, and the journalist is at the mercy of the magazine editor, and they want to sell dirt." End quote. As per this next clip, we're going back to the interview from December of '93. Here, Kurt discusses his plans for the future of Nirvana, including making their next album, the one that would have come after In Utero.
Put out another really good record, and hopefully to progress. I really want to change our style of music. I don't want to turn into a prog rock band, literally, but I want to do something different, really different, you know. And I want to have enough guts to do that. And if it alienates people, that's too bad, you know. But you know, the Beatles went from, not to compare us to the Beatles, but the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and bands like that went from I Want to Hold Your Hand to Sgt. Pepper's. That was a massive progression, and I just want to experiment.
During the interview Kurt did on February 11th of '94 in France, he also shared his thoughts on Nirvana's future. Again, this was less than 2 months before he died. Quote, "I'm extremely proud of what we've accomplished together. Having said that, however, I don't know how long we can continue as Nirvana without a radical shift in direction. I have lots of ideas and musical ambitions that have nothing to do with this mass conception of grunge that has been force-fed to the record-buying public for the past few years. Whether I will be able to do everything I want to do as part of Nirvana remains to be seen. To be fair, I also know that both Chris and Dave have musical ideas that may not work within the context of Nirvana. We're all tired of being labeled. You can't imagine how stifling it is."
It'd be nice to eventually start playing acoustic guitars and be thought of as a singer and a songwriter rather than a grunge rocker, you know? Because then I might be able to take advantage of that when I'm older and sit down on a chair and play acoustic guitar like Johnny Cash or something, you know? And it won't be a big joke, but who knows?
That was from an interview Nirvana did at the Edgewater Hotel in Seattle. It was conducted by journalist Lawrence Romance on August 10th of '93. At one point, Kurt touches on his heroin use.
I've always lied about it because I didn't want to influence anybody, you know? I didn't want anyone to even consider the thought of doing drugs because it's really stupid. As I expected, before I started doing heroin, I knew at the beginning that it would become just as boring as marijuana does, you know? Like all drugs, after a few months, it's just as boring as, you know, breathing air.
Just a heads up, in the last roughly 40 minutes of this video, I'm going to be sharing with you several interview clips I've done with people from Nirvana who share some rare stories about the band. Rare stories most likely you probably haven't heard of before. Much more lighthearted than the heroin stuff we're discussing right now. "It's part of my life that I'm not too proud of. I'm afraid of dying now." That quote from Kurt Cobain is from September of 1993. I found this quote in the book Cobain on Cobain. Now, when Kurt says, "It's part of my life I'm not proud of," he's referring to heroin. Unfortunately, heroin played a big part in the final years of Kurt's life, and any honest retelling of Kurt's story can't overlook this fact. I'm going to explore Kurt's history of addiction, specifically with heroin. I'm going to share with you a quote from Kurt where he discusses how the addiction impacted his music. I'm going to share with you quotes from several of Kurt's close friends where they discuss how his heroin addiction really impacted his relationships with people, how Kurt felt he was being abused by the executives around Nirvana, and that he would use heroin in a sense as a coping mechanism. That was a bad idea, of course, but I'm going to explore some of the emotional reasons behind why Kurt chose to do this horrible drug. And then at the end of the video, I'm going to show you a few clips from people that I've interviewed who were friends of Kurt Cobain's, where they discuss how Kurt's addiction and death impacted them. Now, the first quote I'm going to share with you pertains to Chris Novoselic. "Interpersonal relationships in bands can be complicated. This was certainly the case with Chris Novoselic and Kurt Cobain. According to Kurt's official biographer, Michael Azerrad, Kurt Cobain's heroin use became a sore spot between him and Chris. Chris Novoselic did not approve of what Kurt was doing. According to Michael Azerrad, Kurt began to distance himself from Chris because of this. The following is from Michael Azerrad's article for The New Yorker from September of 2021. Quote, "Chris could have been a crucial port in the storm for Kurt, but, sadly, Kurt began to push his friend away in 1990, when Chris told Kurt that he disapproved of his heroin use. They were never as close again. Things got a little better when they were rehearsing before the recording of In Utero. There was the excitement of playing new songs, working with the revered recording engineer Steve Albini. and starting a new, more artistically liberated phase of the band. But by the time they recorded the Unplugged show in New York in November of 1993, they had become distant again. Kurt surrounded himself with his wife and child and a different set of friends, several of whom were drug addicts, and Chris didn't feel welcome. Chris Novoselic had known for a long time that Kurt didn't exactly have a lust for life.
End quote. Now, it's interesting to hear that Chris felt Kurt didn't have a lust for life due to heroin, yet in a separate quote, Kurt said he didn't want to die. Kurt, of course, was a man of many contradictions, so Chris may have been correct, but Kurt may have also changed his perspective on things. The following is from Cobain on Cobain. Quote,
I'm afraid of dying now. I don't want to leave behind my wife and child, so I don't do things that would jeopardize my life. I try and do as little things as I can to jeopardize it. I don't want to die. I wasn't familiar with what heroin does to people. I did it first in 85, 86 in Aberdeen. I'd wanted to try it forever. I wanted to be a junkie for a few months after Nevermind and the tour. It was a really stupid idea. I didn't understand how evil it is, how hard it is to get off it. It's the most addictive thing I've ever tried. It's an ongoing dilemma. I still have problems with it. This year I've messed up a few times, but I'm not addicted anymore. I haven't had any drug dealings for a long time. I couldn't fool myself or anyone else that I won't do it again. I'll always be a junkie. I've had to excommunicate my drug-taking friends and focus on my family and my music.
End quote. Now, one of Kurt's other really close friends was Buzz Osborne of the Melvins. The Melvins were the opening act during Nirvana's final shows, and according to Buzz Osborne, many of the issues Kurt Cobain had in his marriage, with his management, etc., was largely due to his addiction. Reflecting on the final shows with Nirvana, Buzz touched on this subject matter. This is from an interview Buzz did with journalist Jillian G. Garr. Quote,
That tour was just a fiasco, a nightmarish fiasco. Almost none of it was good. Some nights they played well, other nights it was just horrible. It was kind of depressing. The last night that we played with them in Munich, Cobain was in a massively huge fight on the phone with his wife. And I talked to him in the hallway a little bit, and he was just, I don't know how I'm going to get out of this. And my advice to him was give her everything. Get through this whole thing, get yourself off drugs, and then take it from there, even if you have to start over, even if it means you have to go on tour playing some acoustic guitar, who cares? It was more complicated than that, but that's the gist of the last time I talked to him. He was certainly not happy with where he was, but he wasn't capable of getting out of it. Doing nothing is the easiest thing you can do, you know. And then right before they went on, the last thing he said to me was, I should just be doing this solo. That was the last thing he said, and I just walked outside. And I was just like, this is horrible. He's surrounded by people who are draining every drop out of him and don't care about anything else, because he's heavily under the lash of drugs, a drug addiction that's making it impossible for him to make the right life choices. And that really is where it all ended. End quote.
Another close friend of Kurt's is Mark Arm of Mudhoney. In this quote, Mark reflects on how Kurt's addiction situation was very badly mismanaged by Nirvana's management. For instance, Kurt never had much of an alcohol problem, but according to Mark Arm, management effectively decided to ban alcohol on a tour in 1993 in order to quote-unquote help Kurt, yet Kurt still had full access to the drugs which were the actual problem. Quote,
Nirvana surrounded themselves with really gross people. We did a 2-week trout with Nirvana in 1993. The Nirvana tour was just awful. Everybody was stepping on eggshells trying not to disturb Kurt. Courtney wasn't on that tour. They tried to make it a dry tour with no alcohol as some sort of example to Kurt. Kurt's interests had very little to do with alcohol, so it was a stupid exercise. They had no booze backstage, but we had beer on our rider. So every night, Chris, Dave, and whoever else wanted a beer would come to our little room and take our beer. It was ridiculous. Why didn't they just get enough beer for everybody who wanted it? Why this pretense that it's a dry tour when it's not really? Kurt was taking massive amounts of pills. He was totally stoned anyway. The whole idea that this dry tour was helping Kurt in any way was just absurd. Why didn't they take his pills? Communication within the band and the people around them was pretty much non-existent. On the way to Chicago, someone realized that Nirvana's hotel was far out of town, and the band wanted to stay in town closer to the venue. They canceled their rooms, ate the cost, and booked another hotel. So they paid for 2 hotel rooms per person that night, right? Our beer ran out during the Chicago show, so a friend of ours grabs a case of beer from catering and brings it to our room. Next thing you know, a federal case is made out of 24 beers. All these guys and their crew are running around with walkie-talkies like the Mona Lisa was snatched. Their tour manager is flipping out over the fact that we stole a case of beer and they're going to have to pay for it. He's calling Los Angeles, calls are going back and forth. How are they going to deal with the situation? They just spend how much money on 2 rooms per person? But they're flipping out over a case of beer that they have to buy from catering? It was the most absurd, insane thing. It was indicative of how the whole group of people were running themselves. They weren't looking at the big picture at all. They weren't looking at, what do we really need to do to make sure Kurt is okay? And I'm not talking about okay as in feel good and everything is the way he wants it so he can keep touring and earning money. What are they doing to try to get his head cleared so he can think straight? What are they doing to keep him alive? They danced around the real issue and got focused on these tiny, stupid, ego-tripping things. It was just horrible. And Chris and Dave seemed bummed the whole time, but they weren't really talking. No one really talked to each other. We rode with Nirvana on their bus one night, while our sound guy and our tour manager rode in the van by themselves. I think it was on the way to Davenport, Iowa. During the trip, Kurt is explaining all these pills he's on to me, and he's going, I would really like to stop doing all this stuff. How did you do it? I'd only stopped in July, so it was a couple of months. But I hadn't hung out with Kurt and Courtney since New Year's Eve of 92, going into 93. I had to stop seeing them because I was trying to save myself. I told them that you have to want to quit bad enough and that you've got to stay away from your junkie friends. Because they're not really your friends. They're just people who share an interest in heroin with you.
End quote. Kurt had lots of frustration with the executives around Nirvana, as was stated by his official biographer, Michael Azerrad. According to Michael, Kurt resented the executives so much so that on one particular occasion, Kurt got high on heroin in the middle of an important meeting in order to spite the executives. Yet, according to Michael Azerrad, the executives pretended everything was normal. They apparently had no concern whatsoever about Kurt's health. They couldn't care less about his well-being. This is from the article Michael Azerrad wrote for The New Yorker in 2021. This incident he's describing took place in 1993, the year Azerrad completed his Nirvana biography. Quote,
After I finished working on the book, Kurt and I became friends. I don't claim to have been his exclusive confidant or anything like that, but every once in a while, the phone would ring in the wee hours of the morning. It was ridiculous that he'd call at such an hour. He didn't seem to have considered the time difference between Seattle and New York. Or maybe he thought that everyone else was as nocturnal as he was. But I always picked up. I worried that he might be in a crisis, and I didn't ever want to regret that I'd ignore such a crucial call. Usually, Kurt would want to rail, sometimes volcanically, about management or the label or the band. And after he'd gotten it all off his chest, he'd suddenly realized that he'd been talking completely about himself, pause and ask, So, how are you? In July of 1993, Nirvana came to New York to play a show at the Rosalind Ballroom, a former dance hall in Midtown Manhattan. While he was in town, Kurt had a business dinner with a bunch of the grown-ups, as he disdainfully referred to the various executives involved in the band's affairs. The dinner took place at a fancy restaurant on the East Side. He asked me to come along, I suppose so he wouldn't be completely alone with business types. Or maybe he wanted me to see for myself what he was always complaining about. 8 of us sat around a large circular table. I sat directly across from Kurt, out of conversation range, but I could see that he was uncomfortable. He was withdrawn and not responding much to anything anyone said to him. Everyone tried to pretend like nothing was wrong. They all ordered food, appetizers, entrees, and wine. But Kurt only ordered a slice of cake. Someone asked him, That's all you're going to have, Kurt? Kurt just kind of mumbled. Kurt excused himself to go to the bathroom. He was gone a long time. I considered the possibility that he had sneaked out of the restaurant. That would have been brilliant. But eventually, just as I was starting to think that someone should go check on him, he returned. He was high, dazed, his eyelids nearly closed. He was nodding slightly. It was the first time I'd ever been sure that Kurt was high on heroin. Surely, everyone else at the table could see this too, but no one acknowledged it in any way. And the conversation continued around Kurt as if he were a senile grandparent. It was obvious to me that Kurt got high at the dinner deliberately
as a self-destructive protest. The ostensible purpose of the dinner, aside from dining at a fancy restaurant and putting the bill on the expense account, was to discuss some pressing business decision with Kurt. But Kurt was in no condition to make any decisions. When the check was paid, everyone scattered. So I found myself standing on the sidewalk with Kurt, who was stoned out of his mind on heroin in a city he didn't know well. I walked him back to his hotel, holding onto his arm as if he were an elderly person in case he stumbled. I made sure that he didn't walk into other people or traffic. End quote. Now, in fairness, not every executive/management type was indifferent to Kurt's suffering. Susan Silver, former manager of both Alice in Chains and Soundgarden, once recalled to journalist Greg Prado how during a tour stop in 1992, she saw Kurt and Courtney backstage. What Susan Silver saw really bothered her. Quote, "There was a weird incident where Soundgarden was touring in Europe with Guns N' Roses and they played Spain. Nirvana was playing the next night, so we all went. It was so exciting to be there with this band that we all loved for several years. And now they're the biggest band on the planet. It was like going to see people you think are your really good friends, and you see the show, it's amazing. We go backstage, and all of a sudden, it's not amazing anymore." Chris and Dave were really uncomfortable. Courtney was very pregnant and was on the couch with Kurt. There were probably 15 of us or more in this room talking to each other. But there was this real air of discomfort. All of a sudden, she gets up and starts screaming, "Yeah, we shoot dope. We shoot dope every day. Heck yeah." It's the elephant in the middle of the room you try not to talk about. It was the moment where I realized everything is not okay anymore. Andy Wood died 2.5 years before, and that really wasn't okay. But we all pulled through it, and things started to really take off for Seattle. Everybody was still in each other's corner. They stormed out of the room. Kurt had an interview going on in the other room, which I found out because I tried to say goodbye to him, and I could see that he wasn't really comfortable with it. He didn't look particularly well, but he'd had a lot of health problems. I wasn't thinking, oh, he's high. I just thought he looked sick. End quote. As Susan mentioned, heroin was a Seattle problem, not uniquely just a Kurt problem. In my opinion, the most tragic situation from the Seattle scene involving heroin was the death of Lane Staley. I've made a few videos about that subject on this channel. The following is a quote from Art Chantry, a graphic designer who was involved in the Seattle grunge movement. In this quote, he discusses Kurt Cobain's drug addiction and in particular the fact that having money actually made the situation much worse. This quote is from the book Grunge is Dead. Quote, "I don't know if you've ever had to deal with junkies before, particularly ones that have money. Walls are built around them. It's like the people that are on the inside protect their junkie, especially if the junkie has the earning power of a Kurt Cobain. What you end up with are layers of, it's like concrete circles. That's why that Nirvana t-shirt with the diagram of layers of redemption was so perfect, because that's the way the structure of the Nirvana camp worked. It was very, very difficult for outsiders to work their way through the various layers to get at people that could actually make decisions. It was all designed as protection. And it was true of any junkie. That's the way junkies operate their lives. That's the way the Alice in Chains camp worked. That's the way Lanigan worked. Nobody got inside the Nirvana camp. It was like a compound. It was even hard for the other band members to get through the layers sometimes. It's like heroin defined the scene. Seattle's always been a heroin town. It's a port city. Portland's always been a heroin town. But, like all culture explosions since World War II, when the German high command started to use methamphetamines, every major cultural scene in Western civilization, and we're talking bikers, beatniks, hippies, glam rock, punk, funk, Warhol Factor, the surfers, hot riders, trucks, were all speed freaks. It had a huge impact on our culture. And in Seattle in the early days, it was no different. Crystal meth was the drug of choice. For the longest time, cheap crystal meth was where it was at in this town. There were a few people who took heroin, but usually it's because they got exposed to it in other cities. It wasn't until the money rolled in, and this is true of every cultural explosion you see in these towns, it's followed by heroin. And there's a heroin epidemic. Heroin follows the money. This is the way things always work. Seattle fell right into it. Like any punk scene, it's amazing how many people die. You get all this money, and a lot of these guys, especially if they come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, they can't handle it, and it kills them. Usually through self-indulgence, not being able to spend their money right. Rich junkies are as good as dead. Rich junkies don't live. End quote. As Art Chantry stated, there were different cliques of people within Nirvana handling different things, such as getting Kurt drugs. Craig Montgomery, one of Nirvana's recording engineers, touched on this subject in an interview with Gillian G. Garr. Quote,
There was Kurt and Courtney and the people in charge of getting them everywhere, and then everybody else. There was a real dichotomy. Their drug problems were bad, and they were worried about how they were going to get drugs. They're pretty much sick because they can't get their drugs, and then you go to Japan where it's even harder. He was just a shell in Japan. Courtney was having health problems. Kurt was having health and drug problems too. I wasn't directly privy to it. I tried to keep my head down and do sound, and hopefully not have anybody get pissed at me. It would be stressful because there were times that we didn't know if we were going to make the show or not. Kurt's in the hotel room throwing up, or he's worried about his voice. His voice was always a problem. He was not a healthy guy. Every show we got through was a relief.
End quote. As Art Chantry stated earlier, drug addicts with money who can get drugs whenever they please are in big trouble. Fame was always a double-edged sword for Kurt. With the fame came money, and with the money came more drugs. Kurt's fame scared his Aunt Mary. It's well documented that Aunt Mary was the family member Kurt Cobain was closest with. In this quote I'm going to share with you, she says that seeing Kurt on MTV for the first time scared her, because in her own words, Kurt was not the most stable person. I believe this quote from Aunt Mary is from an interview she did with journalist Jillian G. Garr.
Quote, "When I first saw him on MTV, I cried. Because it was like, this is too much. It was just like, wow. To know somebody that makes it big like that is a really very strange feeling. Because you feel like what I felt for him was fear for him. I don't know what it was. It was all these mixed emotions. I felt happy for him. I felt afraid for him. Just a lot of different things. Because I knew that he wasn't the most stable person in the world. But it wasn't like I consciously thought of that. I was just really excited for him and very happy for him in the beginning. But it was quite a lot for him. I really think music was for Kurt as it was for me at one time, an escape. It was an understanding friend, predictable and comforting. When he became famous, music was no longer an escape for him. It was a nightmare of scheduled creativity and harried performances. It was almost as if he became a caricature of himself and the whole grunge movement. Kurt's success only reinforced my suspicion of how the music business operates. By that, I mean the artist becomes a commodity, a can of beans, if you will, merely a saleable product. Can anything drain the human spirit more?"
End quote. As Aunt Mary mentioned, Kurt was not the most stable person. Kurt, in fact, was a very moody person, and unfortunately, of course, drugs accentuated that. The following is from Nevermind producer Butch Vig. Quote,
"He would be totally engaged. Then, all of a sudden, a light switch would go off and he'd go sit in the corner and completely disappear into himself. I didn't really know how to deal with that." That was a quote from an interview Butch Vig did with Rolling Stone back in 2011. He was describing what it was like working with Kurt Cobain for the first time and how he was caught off guard by Kurt's mood swings. The first time Butch Vig worked with Nirvana was from April 2nd to 6, 1990. During that period, Nirvana recorded 8 songs with Butch Vig at his studio in Madison, Wisconsin. At the time, the band featured Chad Channing on drums. According to Butch Vig, there was tension between Kurt and Chad during the recording sessions. Given the fact that a few months later, Chad and Nirvana parted ways, this isn't surprising to hear. As mentioned, this was the first time Butch Vig ever worked with Nirvana. And, in his own words, one of the things he had to learn to deal with was Kurt Cobain's moodiness and how Kurt would just stop recording if he didn't feel like it. Reflecting on this, Butch Vig told the following to Uncut magazine in July of 2021. Quote, "Chris was really friendly. Chad seemed nice too. Kurt was very likable, quiet but polite. I fed them up at this blue-collar bar called the Friendly Tavern, a real working man's watering hole and dirt cheap. You could get a pitcher of beer for $2 and a bowl of soup and grilled cheese for $1.25. Now, in the studio, I was taking my time to set up, and I could tell Kurt was getting impatient. We tracked the first song and did a couple of takes when Kurt put his guitar down and went and sat in the corner. I tried to talk to him, but Chris explained he got into these moods. You had to let him go through it, and eventually, he'd snap out of it. Eventually, Kurt stood up and said, 'Let's go,' and we cut the first song. I realized that was something I'd have to deal with. He had these incredible mood swings, sometimes several times a day. I also noticed tension between Kurt and Chad. Kurt would sometimes go behind the drums and show Chad how to play. Chris was a peacekeeper, the guy I would go to if I needed some help with the other two. By the time we finished, we agreed to schedule more time. I did rough mixes, sent the band a cassette, and didn't hear anything for months.
End quote. Now, as mentioned earlier, Michael Azerrad, Kurt Cobain's close friend and biographer, spoke about how Kurt felt suffocated by the executives and that sometimes he'd deal with that by turning to drugs. He wrote about this in the aforementioned article he penned for The New Yorker in 2021. At another point in that same article, Michael shared a more introspective story about Kurt and the time he spent with him. Prior to the release of Nirvana's official biography, Come As You Are, in 1993, Michael and Kurt spent parts of several days together in a hotel room in Seattle going over the draft of the book. Now, at that time in 1993, Kurt was concerned that Frances Bean Cobain may be taken away from him and Courtney due to all the controversy surrounding their well-known heroin usage. According to Michael Azerrad, he believes one of Kurt's concerns about this biography he was writing was that Kurt was nervous there could be something in the biography that the authorities may be able to reference as further justification to take away his daughter. Quote,
Kurt told me it was illuminating to read about his entire life in chronological order. Very few people have that luxury. Sometimes he'd take a break, and we'd stand together by the window overlooking 4th Avenue. We'd talk, eat cookies, or look down to the street, where little gangs of homeless kids swarmed around taxis stopped at red lights, trying to wrangle a few bucks out of the cabbies. During those breaks, we didn't speak about the book. Instead, we talked about people we knew in common, music we were listening to, or politics. Sometimes we'd just stare out the window at the city without saying anything at all. Kurt, being a student of rock history, knew that the story of a rock band is essentially a legend, in the sense that there's some wiggle room in the truth as long as it serves the overall myth. So Kurt was an unreliable narrator of his own story. That's nothing new. It would be hard to name any rock star who wasn't the same. It's up to the journalist to determine what's true and what isn't. But sometimes journalists play along because they're naive, lazy, or overworked, or they want to be in on the game because it makes for a sensational copy. Whatever the reason, it works to the artist's advantage. I wasn't rigorous about investigating Kurt's mythologizing. For one thing, a tight deadline meant that I just didn't have the time. And for another, he had charmed me, and I unquestionably bought a lot of his tall tales, which turned out well for him. Kurt sat down at the desk and began reading. He smoked constantly and read intently. I kicked back on the bed and worked on an article or played solitaire on my laptop. It was very quiet. The only sounds were the distant gurgling of the hotel's plumbing, a hum whenever the ventilation system switched on, and Kurt turning pages. Occasionally, he'd pipe up and say, yeah, this reads real good. Sometimes he would chuckle at something funny or sigh at something painful. A few times he moaned and asked, do you have to keep that in? I don't remember every passage that bothered him, but one was about a breakdown he had on stage in Rome in the autumn of 1989. Every time Kurt objected, I'd explain why it had to stay in the book, and he never pressed the matter. After all, that was our original agreement. To do it any other way would be, as he said in our first conversation about the book, too Guns N' Roses-like. Once in a while, he'd point out a factual error, like correcting the name of the aunt who gave him his first guitar lessons. That first night, he got about a third of the way through the book before he started to fade. It was a lot to absorb. I imagine that he was mostly thinking about how this would play to the authorities who wanted to take his child from him. I also think he may have been looking at it as Nirvana's chief conceptualist, weighing how everything squared with how he wanted the band and himself to be perceived. A little before dawn on the third night, he turned over the last page, planted his palm on the top of the stack as if absorbing its vibrations, and took a long drag on his cigarette. Then, he got up, walked over to me and said, "That's the best rock book I've ever read." He hugged me and looked me in the eye. "Thank you," he said, and then he was gone. My publisher was surprised and immensely relieved that Kurt had only a few minor factual corrections. They were expecting him to raise a fuss, possibly to the point that it could torpedo the whole book, which had already happened with another book about the band. What the publisher overlooked was that the most sensational things were said by Kurt himself, but also, once again, I had dutifully noted down Kurt's key talking points, particularly about being a good, loving parent. That's all he cared about. The rest was window dressing. There's a popular misconception that Kurt was just a guileless junkie, but that's a fallacy. He totally knew what he was doing.
End quote. As Michael Azarad mentioned in that article, Kurt had an emotional episode in 1989 while on tour in Europe. At that time, Nirvana was on Sub Pop, their original record label. During my interview with Bruce Pavitt, one of Sub Pop's co-founders, he addressed the emotional breakdown Kurt had in Italy. Here's that clip.
I had published this book called Experiencing Nirvana, and it's essentially us traveling with Nirvana for a week in Europe. Let me just share some of that story a little bit, because that's a time when I really had an opportunity to hang out with Kurt. So this is late November in '89. They had spent 6 weeks in a van with the Tad band. So you have 2 bands in a van traveling, crisscrossing Europe, getting super fried, right? So we get this message that Kurt is not doing well. Like, he is emotionally distraught. He's really fried. We know that there's this big showcase in London in a week, and we've got to get him to the show. So John and I scraped up some nickels and flew to Rome and met the band there. I remember walking into the club, and Kurt was pretty receptive. We had some dinner. Things seemed to be going okay, but that night Kurt had a breakdown on stage, climbed a PA, threatened to jump, came backstage, told the band that the band was over. They was breaking up the band. He literally, I'm just going to say, had a nervous breakdown on stage. So John went for a walk outside with him, and Kurt said, when I look out in the audience, I'm seeing the kids who used to beat me up in high school. That's what I'm seeing. So that's kind of where he was coming from. Again, I told you he was a quiet, sensitive kid. He got harassed in high school a lot. So what we did is we told, the rest of the musicians just to head on up to Geneva, Switzerland, and that we would catch up via train. So what we did is we spent a day in Rome, seeing the sights, going to the Vatican, going to the Colosseum, eating good food, drinking good coffee, and taking a train up to see the rest of the band. So I got to spend a day in Rome with Kurt, along with my business partner, Jonathan. And the more I got to know Kurt, again, he was shy and not that talkative, but because I had a whole day to spend with him, I got to know what a deep thinker he was, and just a very interesting character. And just because he was quiet off stage didn't mean that he didn't have a lot of thoughts going on. So he was very appreciative of taking that time out to really experience the city. It was at that moment that I realized that this guy is very intelligent, creative person.
And were you surprised at all by that?
Yeah, I was, actually. He was exceptionally intelligent. And, I'd seen him at shows, and we, met at the office and so forth, but he didn't really say a whole lot. Chris did most of the talking when you were dealing with the band. So once I really got exposed to the depth of his personality, I had a deeper level of respect for him. And I was also seeing, after that, they played some shows, we followed them, they played London. They had some new tracks. Their show was dialed, and you could just see that the band at that point, by late '89, they were really coming into their own, and Kurt's songwriting was really getting more dialed.
End of clip. Now, to be clear, this situation took place before Kurt was heavily addicted to heroin in the 90s. Yes, in Kurt's own words, he had dabbled in heroin in the 80s, but at that point, it wasn't a full-blown addiction just yet. And thus his breakdown in Italy may have had no connection to drugs whatsoever. Now, one of the reasons Kurt eventually did get hooked on heroin was, in his own words, his problematic stomach. Kurt had extremely intense stomach pains, and in his words, he would use heroin often to fight off that pain. Now, obviously, that was not a good idea, but that was one of his rationales behind taking the drug. According to Buzz Osborne, however, that was just an excuse Kurt made up to use the heroin. I'm going to share with you that quote from Buzz in a bit. But first, I'm going to share with you various quotes from Kurt where he discusses his stomach problems and the relationship with heroin. These quotes are from Cobain on Cobain. Quote, "It's 1993, and I know this sounds like a cop-out or a lame excuse, but I've been suffering from chronic stomach pain every day of my life for 6 years now. I've been to about 8 different gastrointestinal doctors, and it's always been diagnosed as irritable bowel syndrome. I've had 10 or 11 endoscopes where they stick the fiber optic tube with the camera down your throat and they always find a red inflamed piece of tissue in my stomach. Imagine the worst stomach flu you've ever had every single day. And it was worse when I ate because once the meal would touch that red area, I would hyperventilate. My arms would turn numb and I would vomit. When we got home from our last tour, I decided to do heroin every day because obviously a heavy narcotic is going to stop the pain. The whole time I was doing drugs, I didn't have stomach problems. It's not my fault that anyone knows I did heroin. I've never talked about it. When I'm high, it's really obvious. That's why I've never gone out in public on it. I tried as hard as I could to keep it from everyone. I just hope to God nobody is influenced to do drugs because of me. I definitely have a responsibility to talk negatively about heroin. It's a really, really evil drug. I think opiates are directly linked to Satan. I was a successful junkie for about a year. The only reason I was able to stay healthy and didn't have to rob houses was because I had a lot of money. I was up to $500 a day and it didn't do anything but keep me alive. When I finally quit, I had 30 days of excruciating pain. Thankfully, now though, the pain is gone. I've finally been prescribed the right stomach medicine after 6 years of being in constant pain. Finally, I haven't had a stomach problem for over a year now. They never figured out what it was though. I mean, most gastrointestinal doctors don't know anything about the stomach diseases. They just have a PhD, you know? They get paid a lot of money for pretending and prescribing you different drugs. It's a total scam as far as I'm concerned. I've been going to doctors for 6 years and I've tried every drug available, except for this last one. It's brand new and it finally worked. My condition, it isn't a specific stomach ailment. It doesn't have a name or anything. It wasn't a matter of finding out what disease I had. It's psychosomatic. It's part of my nervous system. There are millions of people all over the world who have irritable bowel syndrome. And that's the common term that all doctors call a stomach problem. And they say, oh yeah, irritable bowel syndrome, but I can't fix it, you know? I don't have anything to fix it. There's just a variety of ulcer medicines that can slow down ulcers and eventually heal them, but I didn't have an ulcer. I just had a red irritation in my stomach. I was in pain. I was in pain for so long that I didn't care if I was in a band. I didn't care if I was alive, and it just so happened that I came to that conclusion at a time when my band became really popular. It'd been going on and building up for so many years. Waking up starving, forcing myself to eat, barfing it back up. Just imagine trying to eat your 3 meals a day and just concentrating and just crying at times. And being on tour was a lot worse, it made it even worse. I remember after Nevermind's success, I needed time to collect my thoughts and readjust. The album's success just hit me so hard, and I was under the impression that I didn't really need to go on tour because I was making a whole bunch of money. Millions of dollars. 8 to 10 million records sold. That sounded like a lot of money to me. So I thought I would sit back and enjoy it. I don't want to use this as an excuse, and it's come up so many times, but my stomach ailment has been one of the biggest barriers that stopped us from touring. I was dealing with it for a long time, but after a person experiences chronic pain for years, you're literally insane. I couldn't cope with anything. I was as schizophrenic as a wet cat that's been beaten. I would drain myself emotionally. I wouldn't be able to go outside or go to a party or anything because I was almost schizophrenic sometimes. I was like a mad scientist. My body is damaged from music in 2 ways. I have a red irritation in my stomach. It's psychosomatic, caused by all the anger and the screaming. I have scoliosis, where the curvature of your spine is bent and the weight of my guitar made it worse. I'm always in pain, and that adds to the anger in our music. I had minor scoliosis in junior high, and since I've been playing guitar ever since, the weight to the guitar has made my back grow in this curvature. So when I stand, everything is sideways. It's weird. Scoliosis, stomach pain, that really adds to the pain in our music. It really does. I'm kind of grateful for it." End quote. Now, interestingly, one of the people closest to Kurt, one of the people who knew him well, Buzz Osborne, has gone on record stating that Kurt allegedly didn't have an actual stomach problem. The following is from Buzz Osborne. Quote, "Kurt also told me there was absolutely nothing wrong with his stomach. He made it up for sympathy, and so he could use it as an excuse to stay loaded. Of course he was vomiting. That's what people on heroin do. They vomit. It's called vomiting with a smile on your face. There's also the horrendously overblown tale of him living under a bridge in Aberdeen. Another BS story. As far as I know, Kurt never set foot under any bridge in that town, let alone lived under one. End quote. The story of Kurt living underneath the Yonge Street Bridge in Aberdeen is a reference to a period during Kurt's teenage years when he was homeless and allegedly slept underneath the bridge near his childhood home in Aberdeen. During my interview with Dale Crover of the Melvins, one of Kurt's good friends from Aberdeen and an early Nirvana drummer, I asked Dale about Kurt's homelessness. I'm going to show you that clip here. Then, I'm going to show you a few clips from other interviews I've done with Kurt's friends where they talk about what it's been like dealing with Kurt's death and how Nirvana's fame changed everything for people associated with the band. In particular, I'm going to share with you one of my most interesting clips from the interview I did with guitar tech Ernie Bailey, where he discusses how the band thought Kurt had died many months before he was actually dead due to an overdose. But first, here's the Dale Crover clip.
I read that when Kurt used to be homeless, sometimes he would sleep on your front porch. Do you know if that's true or is that exaggerated?
He slept on my back porch once or twice, which I don't know why he didn't just knock on the door because I was home. You know, he was probably too drunk or something like that. So, I mean, but I would have easily opened the door and let him in. So I think it's one of those things where it's a bigger myth. There was an enclosed front porch, but there was also a back porch that was half enclosed, you know, and I think he might have like passed out there one night, you know, maybe, but like I said, he could have easily just knocked on the door. But I mean, even with like stuff like him living under some bridge or spending nights under there, it's like, probably not really that true.
Yeah, for everyone I've spoken to that was familiar with Kurt have said that he never slept under there. That like he spent time there, but he never slept there.
Or maybe he passed out there. That could very well be true, you know. But yeah, it's probably more of a story, you know.
Does the association with Nirvana, like, is it difficult to live with because like it's everywhere all the time?
Yeah, I mean, it is strange. You know, like I said, my daughter discovered the band without me really, you know, playing them or anything like that. So it's weird. That's for sure.
Is there any one show that has some sort of special meaning for you that you experienced?
I think the New Music Seminar show in New York is probably one of the most memorable. And that is because it was exciting. We were going to go out there and debut the Utero album. Nobody had heard it. And, you know, all eyes were kind of on the band as to what the follow-up to Nevermind was going to be. But I remember when we were setting up for it, we were gearing up for sound check, and we got a call saying to tear it all down and to pack the truck up, and that Kurt had died, that they had found him, and that he had turned blue. And, you know, it's one of those just weird things where, you know, you're in shock. And 15, 20 minutes later, you get another call saying, no, we got him moving. So let's hold off, put it all back, and we're doing the show. So I remember just thinking, like, it's, like, how is this going to be any good? You know, how is this going to be a good show? And they came out and they were unbelievable. It was the best I'd seen them in a long, long, long time. Like, they were phenomenal that night. So, wow. Yeah, so I think it was not only was it like sonically one of the most gratifying shows, but also just as an emotional roller coaster. It's something where you walked out at the end of that night just going, oh, that was that day.
The actual news of him passing away came out. Did you believe it at first?
No, I didn't. You know, it was one of those things where you sort of felt like, oh, okay, well, you're familiar with this drill, and we'll just give it a little time. And, you know, as the events, as the day progressed, you know, there was just more and more things, you know, seeing it on TV and seeing and hearing things that you couldn't believe what you were hearing. And they were absolutes.
So you started working with the Foo Fighters after the fact. Were you surprised that you got back into music? Because I've heard interviews of Dave where he said he just he felt he had to move on. He had to keep making music. He had to go forward. But after he needed some time off first. Did you feel the same way?
Yeah, I think that I was probably more uncertain as to, you know, what would happen. Well, shortly after Nirvana ended, I got a job offer to go work for the Rolling Stones as a bass tech. Bill Wyman had just left
And so I remember declining that and just thinking that, the Stones have been around forever. They've got a road crew that have been around forever. And, with Nirvana, you had this good fortune that these were your friends, and that, there's not a lot of pressure on you, in that way. So this would be going to work for a really big band with kind of a hardened road crew where you'd be the new person, and you've just gone through something that you're just not emotionally prepared to do much of anything, make breakfast. So, so I remember after that year had passed, after Kurt was gone, it was really difficult. And part of it is this experience of somebody who is in your circle being a public figure who passes. It's really unlike, anything else, because, I, at the time, it's one of those things where it's no secret that you work for this band. Most of your friends know this, and a lot of people around you know this. Well, something like this happens, and even though this isn't somebody that all your friends work with or know on a first-hand basis, their losses are real as well. They've lost somebody that they were, they paid attention to, and somebody that they enjoy. And the first thing they feel like they need to do is to reach out to you and to connect. And so a normal process is, if you were to lose somebody in your circle, probably nobody knows it unless you announce it or share it with somebody. So often we'll go to work and we'll get lost in our work as a way to process this. And you might have a friend at this work that you enjoy talking to and getting their perspective with. And so I think, in a typical scenario, you would share these things, and you would sort of dole out your grief according to, your readiness, if you're prepared to. But this was something where you're just being inundated with, usually the lead-in was like, hey, I've been thinking about you. How you doing? It's like, oh, pretty good. Well, I can't stop thinking about it. You're like, oh, okay. Here we go again. And it was just a constant. It was over and over and over. And so it was just something that you really couldn't escape. And so I remember after a year when Dave called up, I knew that he had the Foo Fighter, project rolling, and he said, hey, we're going to get in the van and go on tour in a couple of days. You want to just jump in and just go? And it was just nearly an impulsive decision, but it was like, yeah, let's go. I just want to get out of here. And it was the best thing you could have ever done. It was just to get out of your life for a minute, to get out of Seattle and to get out of your routine and just get in the van and just go. And we were productive again and doing something new. And it was fantastic. And I think the only thing that was sort of bizarre was that where we couldn't fully escape was that every night we were looking at people in the front row, and a good number of them were wearing a shirt with Kurt's face staring at you all night. And so you couldn't completely, get lost in this thing, which is fine.
Are the feelings still as raw as they were back then, or how do you deal with it now?
No, in fact, but the funny thing is that they took a really long time, and it was probably about 5 years ago that I realized you were finally at a point where it didn't really affect you in the same way that it did for a long time. And that was when this idea of this abnormality about, how we, typically, I think, throughout life when somebody passed on, there was this natural process where, just this loss of their presence, and eventually, with the way that memory works and keeping things around, you would begin to lose these details of people, and they would eventually fade, into the past, and you would move forward. Well, this is one where, constantly you go into the grocery store and you'd see, a magazine on the rack, and you're just like, wow, and it was just weekly. And so it was something where I think that in some ways, Kurt changed from being just like a person that you knew to something that's, he's now like a legendary person. He's something that's, he's just nothing like what you understood it to be. And so, and it really sort of like crosses the line to where what you remember is so far gone, and you can just not relate at all to what other people are thinking and feeling.
I hear you. With someone like Kurt, I mean, I was speaking with Alice Wheeler a little while back, and she told me that, Kurt was a very good friend of hers, and when she would hear people like on the TV or radio talking about him like he was this sort of god figure, it kind of bothered her because, yes, he was super famous, but he was a person at the end of the day. In your opinion, what is the biggest misperception of Kurt that there is out there?
I don't know the answer to that because I don't know that I have an understanding of how the mainstream views him. So, I guess I can kind of take a guess that, that he's sort of seen as this perfect product. But yeah, he was a guy who was really good at his job, and he wrote amazing songs. He knew how to sing, and he knew how to be an entertainer. So I guess I sort of view him as that. He's like one of those people who was really exceptional at what he did.
What was that like for you? I guess you knew Kristen, Kurt, you know Dave for a while before they all got famous. And then when you see them get famous, like, what was that like for you? Like, oh, I know these guys. Like, how was that experience?
Oh yeah, I mean, the whole thing, it was totally surreal, because we were just on tour with them as well, before all of a sudden, like, MTV picked up their video, and then they were being played all the time. There was definitely a buzz about them, and certainly about that record, and I think everybody thought it was going to do really well, but everybody was surprised at how that blew up. It was totally surreal. But I mean, yeah, even those guys were surprised by it.
Yeah, I could imagine. So about a year prior to the release of Nevermind, you played drums with Nirvana during their 1990 Sonic Youth tour, that tour being a big turning point in the band's history. At that point in time when things were really getting off the ground, were Kurt and Chris feeling any pressure mounting on them?
Those guys were keeping their heads about it. Yeah, I mean, they're already having some success. And even when I was with them, we were here in LA, and we were having meetings with A&R people and managers and stuff like that. Most of them at the time, they didn't really, they could tell, they just kind of seemed like phony Hollywood types, And I think, just even touring with Sonic Youth, I think that was an influence on them because they ended up signing with the same label and having the same manager and all that kind of stuff. So, but yeah, I mean, they knew that they were going to get signed somehow, or something that was going to happen. And yeah, I mean, even Sonic Youth were doing really well. That tour that we did was for the Goo record, and they were kind of, I mean, for their band, like that was great. They were like selling punk rock gold, So I remember thinking and talking with those guys, thinking like, you guys could probably do that and maybe even do a little bit better. Nobody thought nobody thought it'd be like that,
When was the first time you realized, like, my goodness, they're about to explode? Like, was there a moment like that for you?
Like right before that record came out, yeah. Or just even, it was a good record. Really catchy songs, and, I thought it would do well.
All the guys I've spoken to from the Pacific Northwest, they actually said that they kind of liked that Seattle was a little bit excluded because it gave you guys the space to just be yourselves. That old vibe of like, Seattle for Seattle, is that ever going to come back, do you think, or is that kind of over?
I think the internet destroyed regionalism, and regionalism exists in a new way, but no, that'll never be back. And also, Seattle isn't Seattle anymore. I'm in Tacoma. A lot of musicians from the 90s are in Tacoma. A lot of musicians from the 90s have left or live in Portland or live in Everett or something. So Seattle isn't really like a place where you can, sit down in your cheap apartment and write songs and hang out with your friends that have a cheap apartment and, go to a cheap studio. I mean, that's all over with, along with the music industry and live music and everything else. But no, I don't think Seattle's ever going to return to that moment of community and innocence and all of that. But that's okay, That was then, I watched this thing explode from the beginning and saw Seattle, transform into this, weird version of itself with all these actors and media people, and it became kind of a less than pleasant place to live. And the thing that, just to be positive for a second, like the original bands that were influenced by Nirvana, and I don't want to name names, but we can point it to people. Mm-hmm. They were trying to get signed, or they got signed, or they ran about ideas and started ripping off Nirvana. And Nirvana were so important that they just kept influencing musician after musician after musician after musician. And now when I record people that are influenced by Nirvana, they're good people that like Nirvana. They're not trying to be famous. They're not trying to get their heroin thing going, or whatever the stupid shit that was going on back in the 90s. So yeah, it's at least evolved to the point now where people look at it as music.
Mm-hmm. When it first blew up, like in '91, like what was that experience like for you? Like, I know these guys, and then poof.
That's one of those questions that's so hard to answer, but I'll try to answer it for you, because my studio and my living situation was downtown next to a hipster cafe that if you were from out of town, that would be the restaurant you would go to. So you'd go in there for coffee in the morning and you go, oh, Sonic Youth must be playing in town tonight, or mm-hmm. Oh, Michael Stipe is still here, or it was like a dipstick of the town getting hipper and hipper, and eventually it turned into actors hanging out there and TV commercials being shot there. It was weird. There were lots of local people that had been musicians for a long time, and they somehow thought that had something to do with Seattle, so it had something to do with them, and they found out the hard way that no one cared about their music. There was a whole set of people that moved into Seattle, and especially in Belltown where I was living, there was just lots of rental spaces. And so, yeah, it got really, really weird.
I have no concept of knowing how to be a musician at all. That quote from Kurt Cobain was from August of 1993. I'll be sharing the full quote with you momentarily. I'm going to share multiple quotes from Kurt Cobain, both positive and critical quotes, where Kurt talks about his fan base, his thoughts on being famous, the way he writes music, his musical skills and influences, his thoughts on Chris and Dave, his childhood, and much more. First, let's explore in Kurt's own words how he approached writing music. The meanings behind Kurt Cobain's lyrics have been analyzed and debated for years. Kurt himself has said on various occasions that his lyrics often didn't mean anything. But at the same time, Kurt was known for exaggerating things in interviews, so take that with a grain of salt. In any case, I want to read to you a few quotes from Kurt Cobain that I've come across where he discusses how he comes up with lyrics. Quote, "For me, the reason why most of my lyrics don't connect is that they're all pieces of my poetry. I've used lines from all of these different poems. They're not thematic. And then I take lines out of each of them, put them together, and I make up a theme to the lyric well after the fact, oftentimes as I'm being interviewed. Or someone will suggest something and I'll think, that's a good idea. That's the way people should interpret most of our music. Which is why In Utero is a bit different, because there are a few obvious subjects in the songs on this album, a few themes. It's the first one I've ever written where there are lyrics based on a book or a story. I might have been inspired to write a poem where one of the lines was from a book, but this is the first time I've used it in its full context. And that's how most people want songs to be. They need it. That's pretty much my reasoning for writing more that way, because people need things thrown right in their face. I didn't have the audience reaction in my mind at all when I was writing these songs, though. I've thought about it since. Although I know that's what needed to be done and that's what people expect, I still wanted to do something different for myself in the first place. I don't know. It's really hard to explain. I don't consider lyrics a big deal at all. A good melody line, a hook, and live energy is far more important. Almost all of my lyrics have been cut-ups, pieces of my poetry and stuff. And the pieces of poetry are taken from poems that don't usually have meaning in the first place. They were cut-ups themselves. And often, I'll have to obscure the pieces I take to make them fit into the song. So they're not even true pieces of poem. But again, In Utero is the first record where I've written at least a couple of songs thematically. Scentless Apprentice is one. I've always created abstracts. I love dreams that don't make sense. I'd rather watch a film that doesn't have a plot. Most of my lyrics don't connect because, again, I've taken lines from a lot of different poems of mine and put them together. I'll make up a theme well after the fact, oftentimes while I'm being interviewed. But there are a few more obvious subjects on this album than on the last." End quote. The following is a quote from Kurt Cobain from August of 1993 from a radio station in Germany, where he shares his thoughts on his level of musicianship. Quote, I have no concept of knowing how to be a musician at all, whatsoever. I mean, I don't know the names of the chords to play. I don't know how to do major and minor chords on a guitar at all. I mean, I couldn't even pass, Guitar 101, full Guitar 101. Everyone knows more than I do. I was in a band and I played snare drum during junior high at grade school, and I never learned how to read music. I just copied the other people who took the time to learn how to read, It was just so simple. Boom, tap, 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 and I just copied them, just to pass. I didn't see any reason to, even at that age, I didn't see any reason to learn anything that someone else has written. If you go by the text, you're pretty limited. I have no desire to become any better of a guitar player. I just don't. I'm not into musicianship at all. I don't have any respect for it. I just hate it. To learn how to read music or to understand arpeggios and Dorian modes and all that stuff, it's just a waste of time. It just gets in the way of originality. End quote. The following is a quote from Kurt Cobain where he discovers his guitar style and technique. This quote is from an interview Kurt Cobain did with a magazine in Argentina called Clarín in October of 1992. Quote, I don't practice. I never took classes or tried to copy the style of other guitarists. I really don't care, to be honest. I play the wrong notes all the time in different keys to the others. I find it more fun to improvise what I play and whatever happens, happens. I'm sure you may have noticed in the show last night that when I play my solos, they don't even fit the song. I don't care. I prefer that to trying to be a guitarist with an efficient technique. I find those kind of guitar players boring. I really don't believe in solos, but there are songs that require them. So I assume that I can play one. I played a long one last night in the last song. It was fun. Lots of noise. I used to practice when I first grabbed the guitar, but not now. I don't like polishing my technique and stuff. When I began playing guitar, I began writing songs immediately. I learned a couple. My Best Friend's Girl by The Cars and Back in Black by AC/DC. After that, I started to write songs, so when I had my first band, I already had material to play. End quote. The following is from Kurt Cobain regarding his musical influences. These are various quotes of his that I've come across from different points in time. Quote, first and foremost, the Beatles. For the first 11 years of my life, I did nothing else but listen to the Beatles. Their influence on how I write the chords of my pieces, it's undeniable. So then I started listening to Led Zeppelin and Aerosmith, and finally punk changed my life. And when even that phase was over, I started putting everything together into something that I could create that was my own. Now, the Melvins. The Melvins really influenced me because they lived in Aberdeen, and I watched a lot of their practices. I also like Beat Happening. I like Leadbelly, the blues singer. I listen to a lot of kids' records. Well, just children's records and sound effects records. But I've never been a big music fan where I'm totally obsessed with listening to music all the time, like every day. I mean, I go through weeks of not listening to music at all. I'm always afraid of poisoning myself with too much influence. I suppose it's probably a subconscious thing. Now, punk has set us free. I discovered punk when I was 11, and I immediately wanted to be part of it. I was reading Cream magazine, and the colorful appearance of this music exerted an immediate fascination on me. I wanted to be part of it at all costs and pretended to be a punk, although in my town no one knew what that was. I only really came into contact with the music when I was around 15 years old. In that sense, because no one knew what punk was, the soft pop bands are an easy introduction to the rebellion that punk has embodied. It's definitely more of a pop music than punk is, but it maintains the same spirit. The punk I listened to as a kid was too extreme, and it alienated the majority of the youth who paid it any attention. No one could understand it. I like to think that bands like ours have occupied the place left vacant by the open door that was punk. At the same time, however, I understand that we are nothing other than a shadow of something that already was there. Every time I write a riff, I can't help but realize that it's an imitation of some other piece, that it's not original, that I've heard it already. Love Buzz, for example, is nothing but a shocking blue piece rewritten. We just changed half of its words and the bass line. And then, on the other hand, there's always the possibility that between 300 ideas I've subconsciously stolen from other musicians, one might come up that's entirely me. It's a great challenge. End quote. The following is a quote from Kurt Cobain from January of 1992, where he discusses the influence punk rock had on him and his music. Quote, the Sex Pistols, the Buzzcocks, any 1977 punk rock band from the mid to late 70s was totally influential on my music. It's still our favorite form of music, punk. Even though we grew up in the hardcore generation of the early 80s and were subjected to a lot of, I guess I should say, BS underground music like hardcore, something I've never really liked, the straight edge hardcore scene. So we at the time, while pretending to be punk rockers at our youthful age, we were listening to anti-hardcore bands like Flipper and Scratch Acid. We weren't necessarily into all these real heavy political ideas. I remember in Aberdeen, there's only one radio station, and it's AM. It's a soft rock station, and they play Tony Orlando and stuff like that. I remember being about 14 and wanting to hear some punk rock music, and I finally got a hold of the Clash's fourth record, Sandinista, at the library. But Sandinista isn't a good introduction to punk rock. And so for the next year or so, I decided to create my own punk rock just at home on my electric guitar. End quote. Kurt Cobain once told Soundgarden's guitarist Kim Thayil that Soundgarden was Nirvana's biggest influence, this coming from Kim Thayil himself. The following is from Kim Thayil, where he discusses an interaction he had with Kurt in 1989. This quote is from Greg Prado's book, Grunge is Dead. Quote, "We'd do 10-week tours, and we'd be gone for 2.5 months. I was in Pioneer Square in Seattle. I went to see some band. I don't know if it was the Melvins or not. Kurt was there. And I think Kurt was by himself and I was by myself. I went over to tell him how much I loved Bleach. He was very quiet and subdued. He said, 'Thanks. That means a lot coming from you. Consider yourself our biggest influence.' I was like, whoa. We'd always been a younger band. We'd always been an up-and-coming band. Now we made a record on SST Records and we were playing nationally. And to have a guy like Kurt, a guy you consider a peer, put out a record that you absolutely love, and to have him say you're a big influence was head-spinning for me at the time. It was one of many things that gave us a new perspective about ourselves." End quote. Now, this may be surprising to some, but if you actually look into Kurt's history, it shouldn't be, because Kurt has discussed on many occasions how much he admired Soundgarden. So much so that according to his longtime girlfriend Tracy Miranda, Kurt was actually thinking about quitting Nirvana in order to audition for the bass player position in Soundgarden. Here's the backstory. Following Jason Everman's departure from Nirvana as the band's second guitarist in the summer of 1989, Jason ended up joining Soundgarden as their new bassist later that year. However, in 1990, Jason Everman and Soundgarden parted ways, and Ben Shepherd was eventually appointed their new bassist. Ben Shepherd, of course, remained with Soundgarden for the remainder of their existence. However, interestingly, prior to Ben Shepherd's appointment as Soundgarden's new bassist in 1990, Kurt was interested in auditioning for the part. Here's the Tracy Miranda quote. Quote, "Kurt loved Soundgarden. At one point, when they were looking for another bassist, I think maybe when Ben Shepherd joined the band, Kurt actually thought about quitting Nirvana. He wanted to try out for Soundgarden because he liked them that much." End quote. The following is from Kurt Cobain regarding the making of Bleach. These are various quotes of his from over the years. Quote, "Most of the lyrics on Bleach are about life in Aberdeen. We approached the recording of Bleach like it was a radio session. The key to a successful album is to get out of the studio before you're sick of the songs. A lot of people have said Bleach is very dry. We wanted it to be as loud and as in your face as possible, as raw as we could. I think a lot of music today sounds far too polished. There's no energy. It's too programmed and fake. You hear too much. I want a little mud in my music." Lou Reed once spent about a year looking for a studio that was old enough to give him the sound he wanted, and when he finally found one, he just went in, turned up the power, and that was it. That's what we'd really like to do. We had a few hours every night for about 6 days. There were a few guitar overdubs, but that's about it. All the songs are slow and grungy, and they're tuned down to really low notes, and I screamed a lot. I wish we'd have put Hairspray Queen on Bleach, or something, but the idea of going into the studio again, instead of what we had on the demo already, was enough of a challenge. We purposely made Bleach one-dimensional, more rock than it should have been. There was this pressure from Sub Pop and the sense to play rock music, strip it down and make it sound like Aerosmith. We knew that was the thing to do. We wanted to try and please people at first to see what would happen. There were a lot of real confused messages going on in our brains. We just didn't know what we wanted to do at all. Like everyone else, we were just coming to grips with admitting that we like all different kinds of music. To be a punk rocker and say you like REM, you just couldn't do it. When Bleach came out, there were a lot of comments in the underground. We started to have followers. College radio stations broadcast our music. There was a lot of talk about Nirvana in the punk scene and even in the indie record industry. When we were recording Nevermind, we simply thought it was one more record.
2 years passed between one and the other. End quote. I'm going to read to you Kurt Cobain's thoughts from 1992 on being famous. There are several quotes of Kurt's I've come across where he discusses his views on fame, but one stuck out to me in particular. Because at one point, Kurt says he thinks people will forget about Nirvana within a year. Well, it's been more than 30 years since Kurt said that, and Nirvana remains one of the most popular artists in the world. Now, of course, it's been well documented that sometimes Kurt would exaggerate or say things sarcastically during interviews. But this may not have been the case this time. Perhaps Kurt did really think Nirvana would be more or less forgotten within a year's time. Whatever the case may be, here's what Kurt had to say. Quote, "When you're in the public eye, you have no choice but to be abused over and over again. They'll take every ounce of blood out of you until you're exhausted. Journalists are groveling for any kind of article about us. Like they're going down to Aberdeen and talking to my friends, and these guys in tractor hats and mustaches are claiming to be my friends. They're saying, yeah, Kurt slept on my couch for 6 months. It was great. I sold him his first amplifier. Well, it won't last. I'm looking forward to the future. It'll only be another year and then everyone will forget about us. Backstage at our shows is pretty sedate. I mean, it's really boring. There's no groupies, there's no drugs, and we haven't even drank for a long time. I haven't drank in months. And Chris quit drinking. We wanted to survive this tour, so we even quit doing that. It really bugs me a lot to be accused of being a drug addict. There's constantly articles being written about it. It sucks because I kind of feel a responsibility to kids who might want to start taking drugs. In a few interviews, Chris and I have talked about smoking marijuana, and we read it back and thought, geez, that probably influenced someone. I've done enough pot in my life where I don't need to do it anymore. I learned too late that it destroys your memory, and now I'm suffering for it. I think it's really lame for journalists to write and accuse me of taking drugs because kids are going to read that article and then they're going to do drugs because I do. That's really lame. I'm kind of an example for people, and there are 9-year-old kids who are into our band, and if they think that I take drugs and I think it's cool, then they're going to do it too. You know, I don't like bands who promote drug use because it influences people and it isn't cool. We're under a lot of pressure. We've toured too much, and that has certainly had a negative effect on our ability to create. But it would be insulting after what we've been through and what's still to come to whine about it today. I think that along with success, we're going to be able to set a certain number of conditions. Not touring as much or refusing a promotion that we don't want to do. It's sure that we want to slow down a little, if only to write a few songs for the next album. I have to practically apologize for Teen Spirit's success to people. It's not our fault. I mean, the label is totally supportive in letting us do what we want, but that's pretty much all they did. They pushed the record in radio and they got it on, and I think the success has a lot to do with the programmers at the radio stations liking the music. They sincerely like it, so they played it. There really is there's never any collective conspiracy involved with us or between us and our label. We didn't pay MTV to promote the heck out of us, it just happened. It's been very organic even though it happened really fast. It's really not our fault. We can't end it. I'm sorry. End quote. The following is from Kurt Cobain. I believe this is from 1993 as the record he refers to is in Utero. This quote is about fan mail. Quote, I used to read fan mail a lot, and I used to be really involved with it. But I've been so busy with this record, the tour, that I haven't even bothered to look at a single letter. And I feel really bad about it. I haven't even been able to come up with enough energy to put out our fanzine, which was one of the things we were going to do to combat all the bad press, just to be able to show a more realistic side of the band. But it's really hard. I have to admit, I found myself doing the same things a lot of rock stars do or are forced to do, which is not being able to respond to mail, not being able to keep on current music, and I'm pretty much locked away a lot. The outside world is pretty foreign to me at the moment. We've been touring since the beginning of time, playing clubs over and over again, which get a bit monotonous. You can't breathe, it's smoke-filled, beer-ridden, and even though there are some of the best memories I have, it gets old after a while. When Nevermind blew up, we knew we had the chance to go on this huge arena rock stadium tour, but I just emotionally and physically couldn't deal with it at that time. But I've had a lot of time to sit at home and work it over in my mind. Now that we're playing on larger stages, there's better circulation. We have an amazing PA system which allows me to hear everything. That's usually how I judge a good show, by the monitors. End quote. The following is from Kurt Cobain from September of 1989, where he discusses the origins of Nirvana. Quote, It was about 4 years ago. Chris, the bass player, and I tried to start off Nirvana in a small county about 130 kilometers from Seattle. This wasn't easy because in Aberdeen, our town, it's difficult to find dedicated musicians. The population is made up mostly of manual workers. So about a year and a half ago we moved to Tacoma.
Here, with the help from Dale Crover of the Melvins, we recorded a demo tape that got the attention of Sub Pop's Jonathan Ponman. Then, in Tacoma, we met Chad, the drummer, and with him we really started Nirvana. Shortly after that, I went to live in Olympia, while the other two stayed in Tacoma. Everybody in the Washington music scene knows each other well, and everyone usually cooperates with each other. For example, I play occasionally in the Go Team, as sort of a supergroup that Calvin from Beat Happening brings together occasionally. Recently, Chris, Mark Lanigan, and the drummer from the Screaming Trees, Mark Pickerel, and I recorded a single for Sub Pop consisting of 2 covers of Leadbelly. It'll be part of Sub Pop's Singles Club series. When we started Nirvana, we didn't even know that there were labels in existence interested in our kind of music. Then, when the first Sub Pop records came out, we were taken by surprise and we said, this is the best label we could record for. All of us Sub Pop acts play more or less hard music at a moderate tempo. All Sub Pop bands have their own distinct sound, and I don't like to be all tangled up with the others as if there were no differences. I don't think that all the Sub Pop bands are that similar. It's really hard in the late 80s to come up with the wholly original ideas, so the only alternative is to just rely on your own influences and make do with them. Thank goodness, in this respect, and this generally applies to the state of Washington, the influences that have been adopted are among the most honest and pleasing. Rock has been around for 30 years, and when you play with a 4/4 beat, you run out of ideas sooner or later. It all becomes unoriginal at some point. This is precisely the problem that contemporary rock is facing. We haven't had a really different band getting up on stage for at least 3 or 4 years. The influences are there in our music, clear as the sun. Yet, we're something original, and I can't explain it because it all takes place on the inside. We want to produce records that you listen to, not just ones you rock away to. So, not a record where you can drop the needle down anywhere, and it'll always be a hard, fast rockin' sound. Sometimes I think that our music is maybe dance rock or something like that. End quote. The following are various quotes from Kurt Cobain where he discusses his childhood and why he breaks guitars. Quote, "My mother was a fantastic, attentive, and compassionate mother throughout my childhood, until I started becoming incorrigible and rebellious. She was from a completely different era. You'd go to prom, find your high school love, have your child, and devote your life to them. She was 18 or 20 when she had me, and she did a really great job. My mom was always physically affectionate with me. We always kissed goodbye and hugged. I'm surprised to find out that so many families aren't that way. Those were pretty blissful times. I just remember all of a sudden after the divorce not being the same person, feeling like I wasn't worth anything. I didn't feel like I deserved to be hanging out with the other kids because they had parents who lived together and I didn't anymore. You know, my parents weren't artistic and I was. I liked music and they didn't. Subconsciously, maybe I thought I was adopted. I felt alienated. Right around age 9, I started feeling more confused. I couldn't understand at the time why I really didn't want to hang out with the kids at school. Years later, I realized why. I obviously didn't relate to them because they didn't appreciate anything artistic or cultural. It was their bread to become loggers. I think the fact that I was a really small kid had a lot to do with why I didn't want to go into the logging industry. In Aberdeen, there was no kind of social outlet. We just stayed in our rooms all the time playing guitar. Ever since I can remember, since I was a little kid, I wanted to be Ringo Starr. But I wanted to be John Lennon playing the drums. When I was around 7 years old, I thought for sure I could be a rock star. I knew I could be the president if I wanted to, but that was a stupid idea. I'd rather be a rock star. I knew I wanted to make music since I was 5 years old. It seems unbelievable, but it's the truth. My aunt who babysat me always listened to the Beatles. I grew up with it. For a long time I wanted to be a drummer. Until I was 13 and I started to play in a band in middle school and was forced to admit that I wasn't made for the instrument. My uncle gave me the choice between a guitar and a bike. I chose the guitar. The first song I learned to play was My Best Friend's Girl by the Cars. You know, with its 3 notes like Louie Louie. I took classes for a week. Once the instructor showed me the power and the bar chords, I realized that it was possible to play any note by going down the neck. And I said to myself, to heck with guitar lessons. I started to write songs. When I first started, I was heavily into Led Zeppelin. It eventually turned into what I thought was my own style, but it turned out to be punk rock. I had this intuition that it was better to try to find your own style than to learn technique. It's what I like best in punk. The theory that technique isn't important. What counts is that you have fun in the basement with your friends. Everything else, making an album, touring, doing your job, is secondary. I like cheap guitars because they're light, because they have a corrupt feel.
They aren't perfect. I find it liberates you from the instrument. It leaves room for accidents, for surprises. There's more chance of stumbling upon an original sound with these guitars precisely because they don't sound like they should. The problem is that on stage it can get out of tune very easily. I'm happy with this Japanese Telecaster I'm using now. It has a bit of a dirty sound and it doesn't get out of tune. I'm going to try to keep this one, but it would be a lie to say that it won't ever get destroyed. I've already broken 3 guitars that I liked a lot, and I regretted it the minute I left the stage, but whatever, I can't do anything about it. It's out of my control. I guess it's linked to a feeling of insecurity. In the beginning of Nirvana, we had a drummer that wasn't very good in my opinion. Out of rage, I sometimes left the stage throwing material. I realized that people liked it, and me too. I loved doing it at the climax of the show. It compensated for not having a light show. I really don't know why I do that. I wondered how I was going to play the next day, since I'm a lefty and we were broke. You can imagine what a problem that could be in a little town in the middle of nowhere. The Pacific Northwest is an industrial region. When you live among workers, drinkers, people not generally happy with their lives, you have a tendency to listen to music that gets straight to the point. I don't see any other explanation. End quote. It's well known that Dave Grohl wrote some of his own music while he was still in Nirvana, and that, of course, he is the principal songwriter in his own band, Foo Fighters. Yet, interestingly, in November of '91, Kurt Cobain said that neither Dave or Chris thought of themselves as songwriters. At the time, perhaps Kurt wasn't fully aware of Dave's songwriting interest in particular, but certainly by the end stages of Nirvana, Dave's songwriting interest was well known. In any case, the following is a quote from Kurt Cobain from November of '91, where he discusses his relationship with Dave Grohl and Chris Novoselic. Quote, "We'd be just as happy playing in a basement. Sometimes that's the most appreciable time we have with music is just being together, because we're good friends and we play music. If we weren't friends, I wouldn't want to be in this band. I wouldn't want to be in any band if they weren't my friends. We hang out together even when we're not doing anything involving the band. Chris and I have been playing together for about 4.5 years now, with a few different drummers, and Dave has been in the band for a year. This is the first time we've ever felt like a very definite unit. The band is finally complete. As far as tempo, it's really hard to find a good drummer. I'm really not the type of person who likes to emphasize on musicianship. I really don't care how sloppy a band is, but it's really distressing to play in a band when the drummer can't keep time. I've been writing songs since I was about 15, since I first bought my first guitar, and Dave and Chris never thought of themselves as songwriters. They've never had that feeling to ever want to do that, so I became the songwriter of the band. But we've collaborated a lot more. I usually come up with the basic idea for a song, and then we'd go into a practice room and play the song over and over and over again until it's finally finished, so it's pretty collective. Sometimes we just get drunk, and we want to have fun, and it's really boring to be on tour for 3 months and be in these same kind of hotels and these same backstage areas and playing your show, and then just going straight to the hotel afterward to sleep and then start it all over again, and not eating regularly and driving on a bus for 8 hours a day. It's really boring. And so we do everything in our power to keep it exciting, and sometimes that involves having a bit too much fun. I mean, every time we've destroyed something, we've always been in a really happy place, a jokey mood when we're drunk, and throwing things around and wrestling and having fun, I don't care if it's a cliche or not, or if it's been done by bands before. I think any rock and roll band has those tendencies to do stuff like that just to keep themselves sane. But obviously, if you've ever read an English paper, you know that they like to exaggerate things and make a big sensational story out of it, so it's not as extreme as everyone thinks." End quote. Now, as Kurt mentioned in this quote, he was the lead songwriter of the band. The following is from Chris Novoselic, where he elaborates on that. Quote, "He was the lead songwriter. He has the idea, like he had riffs and a vocal line he'd be hammering out. He'd be holed up somewhere by himself, hammer things out, and then he would just start busting them out at rehearsal. Sometimes it was just a riff and a vocal melody. Sometimes it was a couple of riffs, more like a song. Then it depended on what everybody else's input was. The drummer is really important. The drums kind of set a tone, a beat that tells you what kind of personality the song's going to have. And I'd put my spin on it. I'd get a hit off the song and try to do something interesting instead of just follow the guitar. I'd just go for things or come up with another part, like a bridge part or something. He'd just have the one riff and melody and I'd just bust something out. And then we'd all jump on board to that. And the next thing you know, that'd be another part of the song. A lot of it was unsaid. The band just cranked it out. But it definitely had a leader. Kurt knew what he wanted to do. End quote. The following is from Kurt Cobain on the success of Nevermind and how it impacted him. I believe this is from 1992. Quote, I don't want to have a long career if I have to put up with the same stuff that I'm putting up with. I'm not going to subject myself to being stuck in an apartment building for the next 10 years and being afraid to go outside of my house. It's not worth it. I would gladly give up music for my life. It's more important. I needed the time to collect my thoughts and readjust. Nevermind's success just hit me so hard, and I was under the impression that I didn't really need to go on tour because I was making a whole bunch of money. Millions of dollars. 8 million to 10 million records sold. That sounded like a lot of money to me. So I thought I would sit back and enjoy it. I don't want to use this as an excuse, and it's come up so many times, but my stomach ailment has been one of the biggest barriers that stopped us from touring. I was dealing with it for a long time, but after a person experiences chronic pain for 5 years, by the time that 5th year ends, you're literally insane. I couldn't cope with anything. I was as schizophrenic as a wet cat that's been beaten. End quote. Nirvana tour stories that you probably haven't heard of. That's what I'm going to be looking at here. Some funnier ones, some more serious ones, all across the spectrum. I'm going to explore some obscure stuff from Unplugged, from their early European shows, from their South American tour, and more. And also, I'm going to share with you clips from some of the Nirvana interviews that I've done. These include Nirvana producer Jack Endino, Nirvana guitar tech Ernie Bailey, Nirvana photographer Charles Peterson, and Nirvana's original record label guy, Sub Pop co-founder Bruce Pavitt. If you want to see any of the full interviews, the links are available in the description box below. Now, the first clip is with Nirvana guitar tech Ernie Bailey, where he discusses everything from some of the crazy parts of Nirvana's Brazilian tour to the actual logistics of what it was like touring with Nirvana. Traveling with the band. What was that physically like? Did you guys all have the same tour bus, or were you in different buses, different planes? Like, what was that like?
Well, in the time that I was with them, in 92 and 93, they didn't tour much. We were kind of flying everywhere. It wasn't until the Utero tour that we got back into the buses. 93 had just gotten so stressful, and you kind of wind up with this, as you get more and more involved in this thing, you become more mentally and emotionally involved in it, and you realize that it's something it's not going to get any better. I think there's definitely like this bridge that you cross where you just understand that there's no fixing this thing. It's not going to end well, and it's not going to be okay. And it was just becoming more and more difficult to be around, but it was also having an effect on you overall and just your own happiness. And I remember at one point, just kind of thinking like, wow, I just, I feel frustrated or sad, like we've like the mission has failed. And so there was this concerted effort to want to start distancing yourself a little bit. And so, yes, in Utero tour, they were back to buses and doing all that. I went out for portions of it. So I wasn't really living on the buses. I was flying in and out. We did Unplugged, things like that.
I was actually just going to ask you about Unplugged. I was going to ask if you were involved, but you just said you were. What was that show like just prepping for it and then the actual show itself? How was that experience for you?
At first, I think it was kind of fun because we were going to be doing something we'd never done before. And then it did take some logistical effort to make the equipment happen, because Kurt did have some sort of abstract ideas about what he wanted to do with the guitar and things like that. And it's just not as easy and conventional as like, okay, here's an acoustic guitar that has a built-in pickup, let's just plug it in straight, let's go. So he had just a lot of things that he wanted to do that took a little bit of ironing out. But I think the biggest thing was that the night before we did Unplugged, the day before, we went out to New Jersey and we held rehearsals out there. And just seeing that instilled a lot of doubt that it was a good idea to do the show, because it just wasn't moving along very fast. And, often, like you start working on something, your first pass at it's going to be a little rough, a little sloppy, and then it gets a little better, and then a little better, and it just was not happening. As nightfall was approaching, it was just like, this is something that should not happen tomorrow. This is going to be awful. So really, I remember how I felt like going into the day, and it wasn't until they ran through The Man Who Sold the World where you heard it. And I think that I read something recently where Chris said that he didn't feel like he had it locked in, and he wound up just staying up all night. And I think inviting people into his hotel room So they continued to practice, long after the fact, long beyond like what any of us had seen. So I was really surprised the next day to see what I saw. And it wasn't until hearing Man Who Sold the World that I realized that this could potentially be great.
That feeling of, I'm not sure if this is going to go well, and then they nail it. Was that a common occurrence with Nirvana performances?
At least in the earlier years and all the way up until the Utero tour, it wasn't so scripted to where you ever really knew what was going to happen. And especially in 92 and 93, the shows were so far apart that there wasn't any sort of like a baseline normal. So you go in, and the shows were really kind of all over the place. And some of them were really interesting. Some of them were terrible. And some of them were incredible. You never knew what you were going to see, how it was going to end, how it was going to flow.
And there's one more question about a specific concert. So, Top of the Pops in the UK, Nirvana deliberately butchered Smells Like Teen Spirit. Were you there for that gig?
Not at that one. I remember seeing it though.
What was your reaction to it?
Oh, I couldn't be happier.
Well, what motivated them to do that?
I want to say that was the thing where they were required to lip sync, or at least partially lip sync. I think that was one where it was lip synced with the exception of the vocals. So that was one where they didn't honestly even have to be playing. So in order to draw attention to that, because it is sort of this thing that's seen as being a little bit phony, and I think that some bands don't like this idea of going in there and phoning that in to where they're up there pretending to play when they're really not. And so I think more or less it's just their sense of humor where what's the funniest thing we could do right now, and this is it.
So you also did some stuff with the band in South America. What was that like?
South America was really fun. And that was one where that was an experience that was new to all of us. And to go down to a country to where we don't speak the same language. And to, like when we were out and about around in Seattle, people were generally pretty cool. And you kind of got this feeling of like, well, maybe they're not really that big of a band. And so we'd go down to, there was never like this hysteria in Seattle when we went out and did stuff or saw other bands. But down there, it was really interesting. In January of '93, we did 2 shows. One was in Rio, one was in Sao Paulo. And when we first landed at the airport, we had like one of our people who was working with us stopped and said, "Okay, we were kind of at these 2 double doors," and they said, "I kind of want to prepare you when these 2 doors open. There's going to be a lot of people out there, and we've got these barricades set up, and we're going to wheel you through as fast as possible." And we're like, "Wow, that's something we've only seen in like Beatle films," and that was the case. And so, and that was like the beginning of how that week started, and it was just kind of crazy and surreal, and yeah, I don't think like looking back there was anything quite like it. And I think one of the high points was a handful of us went hang gliding, and it was the first time I'd ever done anything like that. I really wasn't a huge fan of heights, but I remember from my hotel balcony I was watching these hang gliders come down all morning. And so I think the invitation went out the night before, and I'd initially said, well, let me think on it. And after watching, all these successful landings, I said, okay, I'm in. And in doing it, it was one of the most thrilling. I mean, it was so much fun. It was unreal. And I think that Kurt was the first one that went out, and he landed on the beach, and then I went out over the waterways and came back and landed on the beach. And I remember thinking to myself, that's the craziest fucking thing I've ever done in my life. It was unbelievably rad and super fun. And I remember thinking, all right, like, cool your jets here, because, Kurt's like, he's like crowd surfed at Reading. Like, how do you top that, So I remember he said to me, he said, "So what did you think?" I said, "Yeah, it was pretty good." He said, that was the most fucking amazing thing I've ever done in my life. I was like...
Do you have any funny stories from the band?
When my band Skin Yard was doing our last tour, which was a tour of Europe in October, November of 1991, toward the end of our tour, we had a show. Somehow our booking agents got together and we got added to a bill with Nirvana at a club called the Arena. It wasn't an arena, it was a club. It just was called the Arena in Vienna, Austria. And it was Nirvana and Urge Overkill, and Skinyard got added as the opening act. And interestingly enough, we hadn't seen them in months, and this was after, it was a club show, but it was packed and fully sold out because Nevermind had just been out for like a month or two, and everyone in Europe knew about it. Mm-hmm. The band was blowing up like right then. But they had to finish this club tour they were doing. And our equipment had been stolen in Rome a couple of weeks, maybe a week or so before that. Our guitars were stolen out of our van. So we had finished literally the last 4 or 5 shows of our tour. We had to use borrowed guitars from whatever opening band played with us because we were doing our own headline tour. But this one show, we got added to the Nirvana bill. And we had no bass and no guitar. And so we had to basically say, hey, can we borrow? And Nirvana was going to let us use their equipment, but Kurt's guitars were all left-handed. And he was ready to give me a guitar. He was going to give me one of his, Jag Stangs or whatever the heck he was playing, but it was a lefty. He said, well, I can have my tech flip the bridge around for you, but we were sound checking right then. I was like, come on, and Chris offered to let our bass player, Pat, use one of his basses, but Chris, being somewhat tall, needed 2 guitar straps duct taped together end to end because he likes to play the bass low, plus he's really tall. So his bass had 2 guitar straps end to end, also duct taped to the bass itself, so the strap wouldn't come off. So I remember he put it on our bass player, who is tall but not excessively tall, and the bass hung, somewhere below his knees. And we all had a good laugh about it, actually, and then we went to Urge Overkill and begged them very nicely if we could borrow their instruments, for our show. And they were I suspect they had heard a little bit about Nirvana smashing equipment, and they kind of thought, oh, here's another Seattle band. And they were very now you're not going to damage these instruments, are you? They were very do not smash our guitars, and we're just like, no, that's not our thing. We're very respectful. I've been playing the same guitar for 5 years. I had to, because, the guy in Urge Overkill, he had a nice Gretsch guitar that he let me play for our show. And, I just had to sort of ease his fears that we were not another Seattle instrument smashing outfit. So, Urge Overkill very kindly let us use their guitar and bass. And we had one more show with Urge Overkill, I think the next night in another part of Austria. And they let us use their instruments. But that was funny, actually. The Nirvana people were ready to help out, but it wasn't going to work.
Yeah. I had published this book called Experiencing Nirvana, and it's essentially us traveling with Nirvana for a week in Europe. Let me just share some of that story a little bit, because that's a time when I really had an opportunity to hang out with Kurt. So this is late November in '89. They had spent 6 weeks in a van with the Tad Band. So you have 2 bands in a van traveling, crisscrossing Europe, getting super fried, right? So we get this message that Kurt is not doing well. He is emotionally distraught. He's really fried. We know that there's this big showcase in London in a week, and we've got to get him to the show. So John and I scraped up some nickels and flew to Rome and met the band there. And I remember walking into the club, and Kurt was pretty receptive. We had some dinner. Things seemed to be going okay, but that night, Kurt had a breakdown on stage, climbed a PA, threatened to jump, came backstage, told the band that the band was over. They was breaking up the band. He literally, I'm just going to say, had a nervous breakdown on stage. So John went for a walk outside with him, and Kurt said, when I look out in the audience, I'm seeing the kids who used to beat me up in high school. That's what I'm seeing. So that's kind of where he was coming from. Again, I told you he was a quiet, sensitive kid. He got harassed in high school a lot. So what we did is we told, the rest of the musicians just to head on up to Geneva Switzerland, and that we would catch up via train. So what we did is we spent a day in Rome, seeing the sights, going to the Vatican, going to the Colosseum, eating good food, drinking good coffee, and taking a train up to see the rest of the band. So I got to spend a day in Rome with Kurt, along with my business partner, Jonathan. And the more I got to know Kurt, again, he was shy and not that talkative, but because I had a whole day to spend with him, I got to know what a deep thinker he was and just a very interesting character. And just because he was quiet off stage didn't mean that he didn't have a lot of thoughts going on. So he was very appreciative of taking that time out to really experience the city. It was at that moment that I realized that this guy is very intelligent, creative person.
And were you surprised at all by that?
Yeah, I was actually. He was exceptionally intelligent, and I'd seen him at shows, and we met at the office and so forth. But he didn't really say a whole lot. Chris did most of the talking when you were dealing with the band. So once I really got exposed to the depth of his personality, I had a deeper level of respect for him. And I was also seeing, after that, they played some shows, we followed them, they played London, they had some new tracks, their show was dialed, and you could just see that the band at that point, by late 89, they were really coming into their own, and Kurt's songwriting was really getting more dialed.
Hey guys, now we're going to take a look at some more facts from Nirvana's 89 tour with Tad in Europe. The 42-day, 37-show tour took place in the fall of 1989 in various countries across the European continent. Here are 5 facts from that tour. Number 1, ABBA's greatest hits. Nirvana and Tad are 2 of the pioneers of grunge, so you would not necessarily expect ABBA to be something those bands would enjoy listening to, but history tells us otherwise. During the European tour, the bands were often crammed together into a van with their equipment for hours on end. Being crammed into a tight space for several hours is not a very pleasant experience, and so when tensions would start to build up during these rides, the bands would put on ABBA's greatest hits as a way to reduce the tension in the van. Genius move. In particular, songs like Waterloo and Dancing Queen went over very well. How amazing would it be if one day a video surfaces of Nirvana and Tad singing Dancing Queen together while squished in a van in Europe? Number 2, Stolen Passport. On November 27, 1989, the bands had a show in Rome, Italy. The following day, they made their way to Geneva, Switzerland. Riding around in the cram van was taking its toll on the band members, and Kurt was no exception to this. He was really not enjoying it. And so Jonathan Poneman, one of the co-founders of Sub Pop Records, the record label that Nirvana was signed to at the time, Jonathan Poneman bought Kurt a train ticket to go from Rome to Geneva to give Kurt a break from that van. Unfortunately, during the train ride, Kurt fell asleep, and when he woke up, he realized his wallet, shoes, and passport had been stolen. As a result, on November 28th, he spent about 6 hours at the U.S. consulate in Bern, Switzerland, waiting for a new passport so that the bands could continue their European tour. Number 3, flying bass guitar. Nirvana is known for smashing their equipment on stage, especially in the early days. The European tour was no exception to this. In addition to already having a habit of smashing gear, the rental gear Nirvana used during the tour was not the greatest gear, often leading to frustration from the band members, which resulted in that gear sometimes getting smashed. The destruction of gear became such a common occurrence that if gear wasn't destroyed, that seemed out of the ordinary. On October 25th, 1989, Nirvana played a UK show in Leeds. At the end of the show, the band walked off the stage without destroying anything, which was unusual. Anton Brooks, Nirvana's UK publicist, pointed this out to Chris Novoselic as Chris Novoselic was walking off stage. In response, Chris Novoselic turned around and threw his bass guitar across the stage, knocking over both of Nirvana's mic stands to the amazement of the crowd. Number 4, Molly's Lips.
The first time Nirvana performed Molly's Lips live was during the European tour. At the Circus in Gamelsdorf, West Germany, on November 17th, Nirvana performed their version of Molly's Lips for the first time, after practicing at soundcheck earlier that evening. Molly's Lips would go on to be one of Nirvana's favorite covers. And number 5, Breed. Breed is one of Nirvana's most enduring songs. It's the 4th track off of Nirvana's second record, Nevermind. Nevermind, of course, being released in 1991. The origins of the song Breed, however, traces back to the 1980s, and particularly, it traces back to Tad Doyle's diarrhea issues. Yes, you heard that correctly. In Europe, Tad Doyle had an ongoing bad case of diarrhea. The medicine he would use to quell his issue was Imodium. Kurt was fascinated by Tad's bowel issue and named one of Nirvana's songs Imodium, in honor of Tad's medicine. The song would later be renamed Breed. Hey guys, now I'm going to share with you a quote from Chad Channing where he discusses some of the crazy aspects of touring in the States in 1989. This was during the period when Jason Everman was the band's second guitar player. Quote, "One of the bigger memories was when we played in Dallas, and we got caught in that massive rainstorm. It's on the DVD with the lights out. We ended up staying at somebody's house, but it seemed like there were 10 or 11 people living at this big house. And then we had that show in San Antonio where we didn't end up staying at anybody's place. We ended up camping out. When we were out there, some sort of campground, we woke up and heard these ducks that sounded like they were getting ripped apart. Crazy noise, huge splashing in the water. I think Jason Everman was walking down at night with a flashlight looking around the water trying to see what the heck was going on. We're like, could that have been an alligator? Hell, it's swampland. I wouldn't put it past it." Kurt or Chris might have decided to sleep inside the van after that. Milwaukee is where I think some of the footage on the DVD came from. The Pixel Vision stuff, the really weird black and white grainy small screen stuff. That clip is a time when we were driving down the road at night. We put up a blanket to separate the two front seats. Chris was driving, and me and Kurt had the Pixel Visions going. Just started doing random things and saying random stuff. I think we were drinking Jim Beam, wine and whiskey. On tour, we listened to a lot of artists, including Shonen Knife. Those guys hadn't been familiar with Shonen Knife until I brought in a tape. In Boston, I picked up The Man Who Sold the World. I know those guys, Kurt anyway, weren't big David Bowie fans. But I popped it in one time, and Kurt was like, "Wow, this is really cool. This is David Bowie?" I'm pretty sure that's where he got the idea of doing The Man Who Sold the World. Touring definitely had its ups and downs. I think Kurt having that onstage freakout was in Italy. I guess he was questioning the whole band thing and everything else. My perspective on it is kind of a lot different because pretty much after I was born, I've spent most of my time moving. I've moved so many times it's ridiculous, so I'm very accustomed to being on the road. When I'm touring, I'm completely comfortable and happy when I'm out of my element. I may have been the only one on that entire tour that enjoyed myself all the time. I know it was tough. The other guys would complain of being sick of eating bread and bologna spread. Including Tad, who came with us to Europe, there were 9 of us in this passenger van, so we were all in pretty close quarters. When Jason Everman joined the band, the idea that Kurt was thinking was, I'd like to get somebody in there so I don't always have to worry about trying to keep that rhythm up, or if I mess up, there's someone to back me up. So I've got that freedom to concentrate on what I'm singing. We had the one tour with him, and to this day, nobody's really sure, except for Jason himself, what went on. Halfway through the tour, when we got to New York, he got really quiet on us. We tried asking him what was up and never got much response. We had a lot of fun with him until whatever happened changed. Then it got kind of weird. The first time we toured, Bleach hadn't come out yet. We just had the single out, Love Buzz Big Cheese. That was an interesting tour. It was hit or miss. We could end up playing Tucson for 20 people and be lucky to come out of there with $30 to get us enough gas to make it to the next town, where maybe the next town would be a different story. There were these people that would come out. We're on the Sub Pop Singles Club and we know all about you guys. It's like, you do? One of the memories that stick out to me from my time with Nirvana is that I like the fact when we were starting out, we drove this small snub-nosed Dodge van, and it was just the 3 of us, myself, Kurt, and Chris. Sometimes we'd have a sound guy with us, but mostly it was just us 3, or sometimes we'd travel with Jason Everman for a while who played with us. In any case, it was kind of a challenge, but I enjoyed it. Like, when we first started out, we'd play a show and we'd be wondering if we'd make enough money for gas to get to the next show. So it was very touch and go at first. As far as any low point goes, we had this show in New York. They had a rubber mat in this club instead of a carpet for the drums. And so during the show, the kick drum kept sliding and sliding and sliding. And I was constantly during the songs just trying to grab it and pull it forward, grab it and pull it forward. And eventually by the last song, Negative Creep, like halfway through it, I got so frustrated that I stopped. I picked up the kick drum over my head and just slammed it on the stage, which I ended up cracking it, so I had to duct tape it and tape it together because it was only halfway through the tour, so the rest of it we had to do it with a cracked drum set. But yeah, that was a low. I did not like that moment.
End quote. Now I'm going to share with you a quote regarding Nirvana's 1990 tour with Tad in the States, which involves some infamous Kurt Cobain guitar smashing. After this quote, I'm going to share with you a clip from my interview with Nirvana photographer Charles Peterson, where he discusses the famous Nirvana Reading show and more. And one more clip from Ernie Bailey, where he discusses Reading and specifically the identity of a person involved with the show who wasn't in the band. But first, the 1990 Tad tour. This is from Entertain Us, The Rise of Nirvana. Quote,
on February 9th, 1990, Nirvana and Tad began a West Coast tour with a gig at the Pine Street Theater in Portland that received international coverage when Everett True's review ran in the March 3rd edition of Melody Maker. Offering comparisons to Dinosaur Jr.'s then popular brand of pop noise, True chronicled the band's destructive nature, declaring, quote, Nirvana shows an instinctive understanding of the joys of rock and roll normally taken to far greater and more horrendous extremes. Elsewhere, the band's shows in San Francisco and Sacramento were notable for Novoselic's impromptu covers, which typically occur when Kurt needed to change a guitar string. At the first of these gigs, he broke into a humorous rendition of I Wanna Hold Your Hand before Kurt started to play Polly. At a later concert, Chris and Chad played an unexpected treat for the punks, a rendition of the Dead Kennedys' California Uber Alice. Nirvana played 2 shows in one day in San Francisco, rocking the Rough Trade Records retail store on Valentine's Day afternoon before taking the stage that evening at the Kennel Club. Tad and Nirvana were billed as hot hunks at the nighttime show, which drew a sizable audience. Most nights on the West Coast tour, Cobain was smashing at least one guitar, if not 2. Sometimes the destruction came from a happy place, but usually Kurt's rage was driven by frustration or boredom. After all, smashing a guitar was a great feeling and an even greater release. Why else would he trash a vintage Fender Mustang in front of 24 people in Pittsburgh? If it seemed like a costly way for Kurt to get his jollies, Novoselic defended his bandmate, explaining to reporters that used guitars could be had on the cheap in Tacoma, where he lived and where Kurt Cobain often tracked down his supply. According to Chad Channing, Kurt had also become one heck of a guitar surgeon by this point. It got to the point where Kurt had an assortment of guitar pieces at the ready, including multiple necks, bodies, and an assortment of inner parts. When one axe was smashed to pieces, he would salvage the electronic guts and make another. Chris Novoselic joined Kurt Cobain in the art of instrument destruction on February 14, 1990, when he completely destroyed his bass at the end of Nirvana's legendary gig at the Kennel Club in San Francisco. But an even greater spectacle occurred the following night in Hollywood, following the trio's 400-mile drive to Los Angeles. At the end of the group's gig at Raji's, played before a packed crowd of 400 people, Kurt purposely fell backward, crashing into Chad Channing's drums. His actions gave photographer Charles Peterson an ideal photo opportunity and resulted in a picture that would be published weeks later in Melody Maker and go on to become one of the most famous images of grunge. Peterson's iconic photograph captured Kurt sprawled out on top of Chad Channing's crumbling kit in an apparent daze, decked out in his Converse sneakers, torn-up jeans, and flannel lumberjack shirt. As triumphant as the show was, it's hard to imagine how Cobain walked away uninjured.
So just a question about Reading. In the videos I've seen, there's the band, and then there's this random guy on stage dancing with them. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Tony, yeah.
Yeah, who is that?
I know that if you watch the very first Reading, he comes out and he dances at that. So at Reading 91, he's I don't know what the history was of like how he came into the picture. I know I've read it, but I've since lost it. But when they did Reading again in I guess it was 92, they had him come back and do the interpretive dancing again.
Okay. So is he a guy that lives in Britain, or like?
I believe so. Either Britain or possibly Scottish.
Okay. And who is he? What does he do?
No idea. Yeah.
He's just some guy. That's funny. So I'm taking it you were at that Reading show, right, in 92?
No, not 92. I wasn't. It was a really strange thing because I remember that they were putting together, as everybody was getting ready to go for it, it was like, friends were going and they were bringing their pets, and it was just like, what? But there was this decision made just to bring one guitar tech, I think, just to save some money. And so in Europe shows, Big John would work those, and I was working the U.S. ones. So I was doing all the repair work and all that stuff. But at that time, I think they still thought it was kind of excessive to do 2 techs at a show. And it's like you're headlining Reading. And so it was crazy. And I sat that one out, and and they had some, unfortunate situation where a bass went missing off the other side of the stage because we just did not have coverage. So so I think after that show was when it changed, and it was like, all right, we're going to have, we need a little more help on stage.
So you do have that one very famous picture of him at Reading where he's doing that jump in the air and he's got his feet kicked back a little bit. Do you remember taking that photo?
Yeah, I mean, I remember most of them. I mean, sometimes you don't know you got something until later on you got the film back. My favorite photo from that gig is the one where he's just standing there looking straight at me, and it was just, because he just sort of turned and was like, in between a song, and was like, hey guys, I was sitting next to Mark Arm, and he's just, everything okay, kind of thing, and we were like, yeah, go play, man, but it's a really, it's a beautiful kind of intimate, endearing shot.
100%, yeah. So you mentioned now that you were with Mark Arm on the side of the Reading stage.
Mm-hmm.
Who else was there from Seattle to witness that? Do you remember?
Mark was playing in Mudhoney earlier in the day, so it was on pretty much all Seattle lineup. Mark and Mark Lanigan and Streaming Trees and the Melvins, Bill Seven, and I can't remember who else.
Yeah. And what was their reaction to the Reading show, Nirvana's performance?
Everybody's blown away by it.
How was that experience in general, the Reading Nirvana experience?
Reading was just a little bit overwhelming, honestly. I mean, when you go and you look at a list of the photographers in the press tent, and it's 96, So, and everybody gets their 5 minutes or 2 minutes or whatever out in the pit. I mean, Nirvana pulled me on stage, so I was up on stage the whole time for their show. But for some of the other bands, you just get a few minutes. And it was just, so, like, I had never really experienced anything quite like that before. Just in all the sea of scraggly kids and mud, and it was crazy.
Did you talk to the band prior to the show? Do you know how they were feeling about it?
I actually didn't run into them before the show. It was just Alex, their tour manager, pulled me up on stage, and then there was Kurt in his wheelchair, and we said hi. But I didn't see them.
Did you know he was going to come out in that wheelchair?
I didn't know that, no. So there he was with Everett True pushing him out.
And what was your reaction to seeing that?
I was like, okay, what's going on here? And then Everett kind of explained the joke, and I took a few, really. It was very dark, but I got a few pictures. Because of the rumors of drug abuse and blah, 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 and the baby and that was the whole thing behind the joke of him coming out in the wheelchair. So there were those expectations of, like, can Nirvana pull off a show this size? And are they, is Kurt strong enough? And blah, blah, blah. So, I think, just those of us were there were like, oh, this is great. We're lucky to be here, and this is amazing. And I've never seen anything like this.
So after the show, what did you guys end up doing?
Oh, we went back to the Ramada Inn and got really, really drunk and closed the hotel bar down, and it was just absolutely really insane. Like everybody collapsing in hotel rooms and wandering in hallways. And
who was that? Do you remember?
Oh, just my friend Steve Mack from That Petrol Emotion, and just Bob Whitaker, of course, up to his shenanigans. Mudhoney's tour manager.
With a show that incredible, was it hard to stay focused on the job?
I think sometimes the where I didn't stay focused on the job was before and after the shows. I should have taken more sort of backstage and whatnot stuff. So, it's either one-handed, it's like hard to juggle a camera and a drink, so yeah.
No worries. So, was there any one particular song or moment from that show that sticks out to you?
Definitely when they did Smells Like Teen Spirit and the whole audience was sing along with the chorus, or, Come As You Are. And sing along. Yeah, it was really about the audience singing along with the band.
So when did you get to develop those photos you took from the Reading show?
Probably about 2 weeks later, I'd say. Yeah.
And when you saw them, were you happy with what you got?
Yeah. I mean, it was a dark show, so I was a little bit concerned, but I was happy with what I got. Yeah.
So when you're in front of a huge crowd like that, is it often you get those intimate little moments when you're in front of so many people?
It's hard. Yeah, I try and look for those, but it can be difficult to get sort of intimate moments. You have to know that sometimes the most important shots are not the shots in between the shots. It's not when doing the thing at the microphone. If you're always concentrate like this close up of the microphone and the singer, you're just losing all the rest of it. So sometimes it's about the audience, sometimes it's about the space that they're in. Wide angle can be as intimate as telephoto. I mean, you just have to, have that sensitivity, I guess.
Yeah. So, these shows, the grunge shows that you're famous for, I mean, they were chaotic. Did you ever get hit by somebody when you were trying to take a photo?
Yeah, I got my flash knocked off a few times. I had plastic shoes, so it would get ripped off. And I had to threaten a bouncer now and then with a camera. Let go of that kid, man. But it was just good fun.
Just going back to Nirvana for a second, their live shows were legendary, for various reasons. Do you remember by any chance, the first show you saw of theirs where you was like, "Boy, this is a great band"?
That first or second show I saw at the University of Washington ballroom, and it was just, but really seeing them later on, seeing them at Reading in front of 45,000 people, I mean, that's really when it cemented, wow, they can command this massive stage and this, sea of people. And it was like, okay, yeah, this is some serious shit here. Yeah.
I myself, I've done a little bit of concert photography as well. I've done mostly concert videography, but it's more or less kind of the same vibe. And sometimes you're enjoying the show and, you're taking the photos, you're taking the videos, and you want to stay focused on the performance, but you're actually enjoying the performance at the same time. For you, has it ever happened where, you kind of got lost in the moment enjoying the show instead of actually taking the photographs that you intended to?
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, certainly. They're even a 45-minute show or even a 20-minute show sometimes can be long. If you can't, especially back in the film days, I mean, film was precious, so you weren't photographing the entire show. So, yeah. But yeah, you had to be careful that you didn't get too lost and not beyond to miss the moment.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, and that, and I think that's also what made my photography somewhat unique is that, I'd say 75% of the time, I'm not really even looking through the viewfinder. So, I moved to the music. I got into the front. I wanted to make it, and it feel like you felt the experience of being at one of these shows and what it was like. And so, if I was just to go out there and stand rigid and try and do the perfect shot, it just wasn't going to work out that way. So it's really it was about being loose and looking for new angles and just, kind of just what the music was doing.
You were shooting analog because there's no digital at the time. How did you, if you weren't looking at the viewfinder, how did you know if it was in focus when you were taking?
Well, if you're using wider angle lenses, you have depth of field, so it'll flash, so it'll come into play, and you kind of pre-focus. You're 4 feet away, so you set it at 4 feet, and I can pretty much shoot from anywhere here, and with a 24 millimeter at f/5.6, it's going to be in focus. I still do that. I mean, that's still how I operate with photographing my kids or whatever. With a Leica, I just shoot because Otherwise, you're just.
Yeah, it takes the fun out of it a little bit, right?
Well, it's not even fun. It's the magic. It's not sort of. But I know my gear so well that I know what that angle is going to do.